3 years after a devastating divorce left me with nothing but a suitcase and shattered trust, my former mother-in-law cornered me in a hospital waiting room. With a smug smile, she looked me up and down and said, "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made. Now he has a baby boy with your best friend." I just smiled, tapped my luxury watch, and asked, "Is that what you truly believe?" 8 minutes later, a man walked through those hospital doors, and her face lost every drop of color. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch the people who broke you get exactly what they deserve. My name is Chelsea, 34 years old, and I'm about to tell you how 8 minutes completely dismantled the false empire my ex-husband built with the woman I once called a sister. The air in the VIP waiting lounge of Chicago General Hospital was sterile and cold, carrying that faint chemical scent of antiseptic mixed with expensive coffee. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The morning sunlight caught the edge of my tailored charcoal blazer, a custom piece that projected the quiet, absolute authority I had spent the last 3 years building. I held my tablet in one hand, scrolling through a highly confidential digital file. Every line of data on that screen represented a nail in the coffin of a man who thought he had buried me. I was so engrossed in the financial discrepancies glowing on my screen that I almost did not hear the sharp, obnoxious click of designer heels against the polished marble floor. It was a rhythmic, demanding sound that demanded attention from everyone in the vicinity. I did not look up right away. I simply swiped to the next page of my report, memorizing wire transfer dates and offshore account numbers. Then a voice cut through the quiet hum of the lounge. A voice that instantly transported me back to a time when I was small, anxious, and desperate for approval. Well, if it is not the ghost of failures past. I locked my tablet screen, slipping it smoothly into my leather briefcase before turning around. Standing barely 3 feet away was Joanne. My ex-mother-in-law looked exactly as I remembered her, only more heavily invested in maintaining the illusion of old money. She wore a pristine cream-colored cashmere coat that draped perfectly over her shoulders, and she clutched a limited-edition designer handbag that I knew for a fact cost more than most people's annual salary. In her other hand, she gripped the strings of an oversized, gaudy balloon bouquet. The shiny mylar balloon screamed, "It is a boy," in glittering blue letters. Joanne tilted her head, her heavily highlighted hair catching the lounge lights. She looked me up and down, her eyes performing that familiar, critical sweep she used to do whenever I arrived at her Sunday dinners. She was searching for signs of defeat for the broken, weeping woman she had helped throw out onto the street 3 years ago. Instead, she found a woman who did not flinch. "Chelsea," she said, drawing out my name like a mild insult. "What on earth are you doing in the VIP maternity wing? Do not tell me you are still trying to find a doctor to fix those defective parts of yours." The cruelty in her words was intentional, designed to strike at the deepest insecurities I used to harbor. Years ago, a comment like that would have sent me running to the bathroom to cry silent, agonizing tears. I would have felt the crushing weight of inadequacy pressing down on my chest. But today, the words simply bounced off my armor. "Hello, Joanne," I said, my voice perfectly level, calm, and unnervingly soft. "It is a small world." She stepped closer, invading my personal space with the aggressive entitlement she had perfected over decades. The scent of her heavy floral perfume threatened to overpower the sterile hospital air. She tightened her grip on her designer handbag, thrusting it slightly forward as if to make sure I noticed its luxury. "It is a beautiful world," she corrected, her lips curling into a deeply malicious smile. "Especially today. I suppose you saw the balloons. I am a grandmother, Chelsea, a proud grandmother to a perfect, healthy baby boy." "Congratulations," I offered, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "I am sure that is a monumental occasion for you." She scoffed, stepping even closer until I could see the fine lines of bitterness etched around her mouth. "It is the greatest day of my life. And do you know why? Because my son finally got everything he deserves. Leaving you was the best decision Cameron ever made." She paused, letting the venom drip from her words, waiting for me to shatter. When I simply maintained steady eye contact, she pushed harder. He is upstairs right now in the most expensive maternity suite this hospital has to offer. And resting in that suite is Ashley. She gave Cameron the one thing you never could. She gave him a family, a legacy. She gave him a son. Hearing Ashley's name still triggered a brief phantom ache in my chest, but I quickly smothered it. Ashley had been my best friend since college. She was my maid of honor. She was the woman who held my hand while I cried over negative pregnancy tests. And she was the woman who had been sleeping with my husband in our marital bed while I was working late to pay our mortgage. Joanne watched my face hungrily, eager to feast on my pain. "It must be so hard for you," she mocked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Standing here all alone, a barren career-obsessed spinster, looking at what could have been yours if you had just been a real woman. Ashley is a natural mother. She is soft and nurturing, and she knows how to treat a successful man. Cameron is a vice president at a major tech firm now, you know. He is a provider. He stepped up into true manhood the moment he dropped your dead weight." I listened to her speech, absorbing every insult, every arrogant claim, every desperate attempt to assert dominance. I looked at her expensive coat. I looked at the extravagant balloons. And then I looked at the designer handbag she was clutching so proudly. I knew the exact transaction history of that bag. I knew the specific corporate routing number that had been used to purchase it. I knew the precise trail of federal wire fraud that funded this entire illusion she was standing in front of. Joanne mistook my silent observation for jealousy. She thought I was mourning the loss of a successful husband and the life I could have shared with him. She thought I was crushed by the realization that my former best friend was living my dream. "You really should leave, Chelsea," Joanne sneered, waving a hand toward the elevator banks. "It is pathetic for you to be lurking around here. Cameron and Ashley do not need to see your desperate face ruining their perfect day. They are wealthy, happy, and moving forward. You are just a sad reminder of a mistake Cameron corrected. Go home, if you even have one." I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached up and adjusted the cuff of my blazer, revealing the heavy diamond-studded timepiece on my wrist. I slowly, deliberately checked the time. "You know, Joanne," I said, my tone conversational, almost pleasant. "I have spent the last 3 years thinking about this exact moment. I used to wonder what I would say to you if we ever crossed paths again. I wondered if I would scream or cry or demand apologies for the way you and your son destroyed my life." Joanne rolled her eyes, a harsh sound escaping her throat. "Oh, please do not play the victim. You were cold and ambitious, and Cameron needed a warm, loving wife. Ashley provided that. You have no one to blame but yourself." I smiled, a genuine predatory smile that finally caused a flicker of uncertainty to pass through Joanne's eyes. She took a microscopic step back, her knuckles turning white around the handles of her stolen handbag. "I am not playing the victim, Joanne," I replied, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "I am just making an observation. You talk about Cameron's wealth. You brag about this expensive hospital suite and that gorgeous bag you are holding. You talk about his great success and the legacy he is building with the woman who stole my life." I took a step forward, closing the distance she had retreated. I looked deep into her eyes, stripping away every ounce of her fabricated superiority. "Is that what you believe?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Do you truly believe that Cameron is a successful provider? Do you believe that your perfect new family is built on solid ground?" "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice wavering just a fraction. "You are just jealous. You are bitter and jealous, and trying to ruin my joy." I checked my luxury watch one more time, tapping the crystal face with my index finger. The second hand ticked forward with relentless precision. "I am not trying to ruin anything, Joanne. I am simply keeping a schedule. Enjoy these next 8 minutes. I suggest you take a deep breath, look at those pretty balloons, and savor this exact feeling of triumph." She frowned, her heavily powdered face scrunching in confusion. 8 minutes? What happens in 8 minutes? "You are speaking nonsense, Chelsea. You always did have a flair for unhinged drama. I am going back upstairs to my son and my beautiful new grandson." I stepped aside, gesturing toward the hallway with a polite sweep of my hand. By all means, go ahead. But I promise you, Joanne, you will want to be standing right here when the elevator doors open. Because those next 8 minutes are the last peaceful minutes of your life. She glared at me, clearly torn between her desire to flee from my unnerving calmness and her need to have the last word. She puffed out her chest, attempting to regain the high ground. You are pathetic, she spat. Just a sad, lonely woman trying to scare me with empty threats. Cameron won. Ashley won. You lost. Accept it and disappear. I did not reply. I just stood there, projecting absolute stillness. I had spent 3 grueling, agonizing years rebuilding myself from the ashes of their betrayal. I had worked nights, weekends, holidays. I had transformed my pain into a weapon so sharp they would never even feel the cut until they were already bleeding out. I knew the truth about Cameron. I knew the truth about the money. I knew the truth about the company he claimed to run. And most devastatingly, I knew the biological truth about the baby resting in the suite upstairs. The digital file in my briefcase held the power to eradicate every single thing Joanne was currently bragging about. The federal agents were already in the building. The pieces were already in motion. The trap I had meticulously built over the past 6 months was about to spring shut with terrifying force. Joanne stood her ground, clutching her balloons, her chin raised in defiance. She was determined to prove she was not intimidated by me. She was determined to watch me walk away in shame. But I was not going anywhere. I simply stood by the windows, listening to the soft hum of the hospital ventilation and the distant chime of the elevator bank. The countdown had begun, and I was going to savor every single second of the destruction I was about to unleash. Joanne stood completely frozen, her knuckles turning a stark bone white against the handles of her luxury handbag. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask slipped, revealing the deeply insecure woman beneath. She stared at me, trying to process the absolute certainty in my voice. I could see the gears turning in her head as she desperately searched for a way to regain the upper hand. She was used to a version of me that apologized for existing, a version that shrank away from conflict and swallowed every insult with a polite smile. She forced a harsh, grating laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the glass walls of the waiting lounge. You really have lost your mind, Chelsea. A countdown. What is this, some kind of cheap cinematic parlor trick? You think you can stand there in your stiff little suit and intimidate me? You are nothing but a barren, career-obsessed spinster who could not keep a man warm if her life depended on it. She took a step forward, wielding her cruelest words like a shield. Cameron saw right through your empty ambition. You were never going to be a real wife. You were never going to build a legacy. You just cared about your spreadsheets and your late nights at the office. Ashley actually understands what a successful man needs. She understands family. That is why she is upstairs recovering in a suite that costs more per night than you used to make in a month. She gave him a son. What did you ever give him besides coldness and failure? 3 years ago, those words would have shattered my rib cage. I would have felt the familiar suffocating shame rising in my throat. I would have remembered the countless nights I sat on my bathroom floor, crying over another negative pregnancy test, while Cameron slept soundly in the next room. But standing here now, all I felt was a profound clinical fascination. Joanne was a textbook narcissist, cornered and lashing out with the only weapons she knew. I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms or display any defensive body language. I simply lowered my gaze to the pristine leather bag clutched in her trembling hands. That is a stunning piece, Joanne, I said, my voice entirely conversational. Bleu Nuit Togo leather with palladium hardware. A classic Birkin 30. Retail is what, around $12,000. But we both know you do not have the patience for a boutique waiting list. To get that specific color immediately on the secondary market, you would have to pay closer to $25,000. Joanne preened instinctively, her vanity briefly overriding her panic. She lifted the bag slightly, her chest puffing out with manufactured pride. Cameron bought it for me. A push present for the grandmother, he called it. He said he wanted to reward the woman who taught him family values. Because he knows how to treat the women who actually bring worth to his life, something you would know nothing about. I smiled slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift her weight uncomfortably. $25,000, I repeated, letting the numbers hang in the sterile hospital air. Purchased on the 14th of October. Joanne's eyes narrowed. How could you possibly know when he bought it? I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Because, Joanne, I know exactly how he paid for it. The transaction was routed through a shell vendor called Apex Consulting. It was billed to Nexus Logistics as a fourth-quarter marketing retention expense, approved directly by the Vice President of Operations, your beloved successful son. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her heavy makeup looking like a pale mask. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. It is truly amazing what a man can afford on a base salary when he uses the corporate accounts as his personal piggy bank. I continued, keeping my tone terrifyingly calm. Did you really think a mid-level vice president at a tech startup was generating enough legitimate liquid cash to fund a luxury hospital maternity suite, a country club membership, and $25,000 handbags? Did you never once question where the money was coming from? You are lying, she stammered, her voice suddenly lacking all its previous venom. You are just jealous of his bonus structure. Cameron works incredibly hard. He is brilliant. You are making this up to scare me because you are bitter. I reached up and tapped the crystal face of my watch. The second hand swept past the 12. 7 minutes left, Joanne. I narrated the passage of time, watching her eyes dart toward the elevator bank. You can call me bitter all you want, but federal wire fraud does not care about your feelings. Neither do the venture capitalists who just acquired Nexus Logistics. The same venture capitalists who hired my forensic auditing firm to restructure the company. She took another step back, her heel catching slightly on the edge of a waiting lounge rug. She stumbled but caught herself, her grip on the balloon bouquet tightening until the plastic strings cut into her fingers. You are auditing his company, she whispered, the reality finally beginning to pierce through her thick layers of denial. I am not just auditing it, Joanne. I have spent the last 6 months dissecting it, I corrected. Every fake vendor invoice, every offshore wire transfer, every stolen dollar used to prop up this pathetic illusion of old money you are so desperate to project. I watched him siphon millions. I watched him buy this fake life for Ashley. And I documented every single keystroke. She shook her head violently, the bright balloons bobbing wildly above her. No. No, Cameron would never do that. He is a good man. He is a family man. He gave me a grandson. You are just trying to poison this day because you are empty inside. You always were. Remember how you used to cry when you could not get pregnant. Remember how broken you were. She was desperate now, pulling out the oldest, most painful memories in a frantic attempt to hurt me enough to make me stop. She was trying to drag me back to the woman I used to be. You used to bring those awful herbal fertility teas to Sunday dinner. I recalled, my voice remaining as smooth as glass. You would place them on the table in front of everyone and tell me I needed to fix my hostile environment. You told the entire extended family that I was too stressed and too masculine to carry a child. You watched me endure hormone injections and invasive procedures. You watched me break myself into pieces trying to give your son a child. It was the truth, she snapped, a desperate edge creeping into her tone. You were defective. Ashley proved that. She got pregnant without even trying. The problem was always you, Chelsea. I checked my watch again. The smooth sweep of the mechanics was the only sound keeping time with the pounding of her heart, which I could practically see fluttering against her cashmere coat. 6 minutes, I announced. I took a deep breath, savoring the sterile air, the absolute control I held over the room. You really love resting your entire ego on that baby, do you not, Joanne? Your strong genetics, your biological legacy, the proof of Cameron's true manhood. It is proof, she shot back, her voice shrill. He is upstairs right now holding his biological son, a son that shares my bloodline. You can invent all the financial lies you want, but you cannot change the fact that he built a family without you. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of humor, sharp and slicing. Joanne the financial fraud was only the second most interesting thing I found on the Nexus Logistics private servers. She froze, her eyes widening. What are you talking about? When you audit a company prior to a massive acquisition, you get access to everything, I explained, taking another slow step toward her. The corporate emails, the private instant messaging channels, the personal expense reports routed through the company health insurance plan. I saw everything Cameron tried to hide. I watched her chest rise and fall in rapid, shallow breaths. The confidence had been completely stripped away, leaving only a terrified older woman clutching a stolen handbag and a bunch of cheap balloons. She wanted to run. I could see her eyes darting toward the exit, but she was paralyzed by morbid curiosity and rising dread. She had to know. She was entirely trapped in my web. Enjoy these final few minutes of ignorance, Joanne. Savor the feeling of being a proud grandmother. Hold on to that delusion for just a little while longer. Because when that elevator arrives, it is going to bring a reality so devastating you will wish you had never walked into this lounge. Joanne swallowed hard, but her pride refused to let her back down. She shifted her grip on the balloon bouquet, her chin lifting as she clung to the one tangible victory she thought she held. You can spin whatever financial fairy tales you want, Chelsea. She snapped, her voice regaining a fraction of its former haughtiness. You can wave your tablet around and make empty threats about venture capitalists. But none of that matters. Do you want to know why? Because money comes and goes. Legacy is forever. She pointed a manicured finger toward the ceiling, pointing toward the maternity ward above us. Up there is a baby boy. A perfect, healthy baby boy with the strongest genetics this family has to offer. He has Cameron's eyes. He has my father's strong jawline. He is the physical proof of our bloodline continuing. Ashley gave us a biological heir. She gave Cameron the genetic legacy he always deserved. And no amount of your corporate auditing can erase the fact that my son produced a beautiful biological child. I listened to her desperate boast, the corners of my mouth turning up into a cold smile. Strong genetics, a biological legacy. It was almost poetic how predictably she clung to those exact phrases. They were the very same phrases she used to bludgeon me with during the darkest years of my marriage. I took a slow breath, letting the sterile hospital air fill my lungs. Do you remember our Sunday dinners, Joanne? I asked, my voice dropping to a deceptively gentle register. Because I remember them vividly. I remember sitting at your massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by your siblings and cousins and extended friends. I remember the exact way the crystal glasses clinked and the way the room would suddenly go dead silent whenever you decided it was time for your favorite performance. Joanne crossed her arms, her designer coat rustling stiffly. I have no idea what you are talking about. I hosted wonderful dinners. We were trying to make you feel like part of the family. You were trying to break me, I corrected, keeping my tone perfectly measured. You loved having an audience. Do you remember what you used to bring out right after the dessert was served? Every single Sunday, without fail, you would emerge from your kitchen holding a steaming mug. You would place it directly in front of me, sliding it across the polished wood so everyone could see. Joanne shifted her weight, her eyes darting away for a brief second. It was just tea. I was trying to help you with your little problem. It was not just tea, Joanne. It was a weapon. You called it your special fertility blend. You would announce to a table of 20 people that you had sourced it from a highly recommended holistic specialist because clearly traditional medicine was failing my defective body. You would stand there smiling that exact same smug smile you are wearing right now and loudly instruct me to drink every last drop. You told my father-in-law, my cousins-in-law, and complete strangers that my womb was a hostile environment. You said my body was too stressed and too masculine from working so many hours to do the one natural thing a woman was put on this earth to do. I stepped closer, forcing her to look me in the eye. I drank that vile bitter tea every Sunday while the entire table watched me in humiliating silence. I drank it while burning with shame. And what did Cameron do? He sat right next to me playing the tragic supportive husband. He would pat my knee and look at you with those sad puppy dog eyes, letting everyone believe he was suffering so nobly through my biological failures. You were failing, she spat back, her defensiveness flaring. You could not give him a child. What did you expect us to do? Pretend it was not happening? We spent a fortune on doctors for you. We did spend a fortune, I agreed. But let us be very clear about who was doing the suffering. Do you have any idea what those fertility treatments actually entailed, Joanne? Did Cameron ever tell you what my life was like behind closed doors, while you were bragging to your country club friends about how supportive your son was being? She opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off, my voice sharp and commanding. I spent 2 years becoming a human pincushion. I woke up at 5 in the morning every single day to inject synthetic hormones directly into my stomach. My abdomen was covered in deep purple and yellow bruises. I was constantly nauseous, exhausted, and emotionally shattered. I went to the clinic 3 times a week for invasive, painful ultrasounds. I had doctors prodding and poking me, adjusting my medications, treating my body like a broken machine that refused to start. Joanne looked away, her gaze fixing on the hospital wall, but I refused to let her escape the reality of what she had endorsed. I underwent 3 separate egg retrieval surgeries. I continued my words, striking her like physical blows. Do you know what that feels like? They put you under anesthesia and extract pieces of your future from your body. I woke up from those procedures in agonizing pain, cramping so badly I could barely stand upright. And through it all, I blamed myself. I hated my own reflection. I looked in the mirror and saw exactly what you told everyone I was. A barren, empty vessel holding your son back from his perfect life. You are being dramatic, Joanne muttered, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Women go through IVF all the time. You just could not handle it. I handled it, I stated firmly. I handled it while working 60-hour weeks to pay the mortgage on the house you eventually helped Ashley steal from me. I handled the physical agony and the emotional devastation. But the absolute worst part, Joanne, was the gaslighting. The systemic, coordinated psychological warfare you and your son waged against me. I took another step, ensuring she could not look anywhere but directly at my face. You sat in my living room after my second failed embryo transfer. I was practically bedridden from the complications. You sat on my sofa sipping my coffee, and you looked me dead in the eye and said, "Maybe God just knows you do not have the maternal instinct required to raise a child." You told me my ambition was a curse that poisoned my body. She gripped the balloon strings tighter, the plastic squeaking under the pressure. I was giving you tough love, Chelsea. Someone had to tell you the truth. Cameron was too soft on you. He wanted a baby so badly it was tearing him apart. Ashley saw his pain. She saw how much he needed to be a father. Ashley saw a bank account and an opportunity, I corrected smoothly. And you saw a pliable, easily manipulated girl who would smile and nod and let you play the wealthy matriarch. But let us focus on that pain you claim Cameron was in. Let us focus on how badly he wanted to be a father. I let the silence hang for a moment, watching the nervous flutter of Joanne's pulse at the base of her neck. She was trying to remain defiant, but the foundation of her arrogance was beginning to crack. She could sense that my recounting of this medical trauma was not a plea for sympathy. It was the setup for an execution. You loved the narrative, Joanne. The tragic, handsome son chained to the broken career woman. It fed your need for drama and gave you the perfect excuse to push me out and bring Ashley in. You truly believe that my body was the problem, do you not? You believe that Cameron is a genetic marvel who just needed the right woman to unlock his legacy. He proved it, she retorted, her voice regaining a frantic edge. The proof is upstairs, Chelsea. He has a son, my grandson. The doctors said the baby is perfect. So all your complaints, all your whining about the treatments and the injections, it just proves my point. You were the broken one. The moment he found a healthy, natural woman, he got exactly what he wanted. I laughed, a low, chilling sound that made her physically flinch. "Oh, Joanne," I said, shaking my head slowly. "The irony of your absolute blindness is almost too delicious. You built your entire superiority complex on my supposed infertility. You justified destroying my marriage, stealing my home, and ruining my reputation, all because you believed I was medically incapable of giving your family what it deserved. I paused, ensuring my next words would hit with maximum devastation. But you see, when you perform a massive forensic audit on a company, you do not just find the wire fraud and the embezzled funds. When a narcissist like your son thinks he owns the company's server, he gets incredibly sloppy with what he stores on it. He forgets that corporate emails and private server drives are fully accessible to the lead auditor holding the master decryption keys. Joanna's breathing became shallow. What does that have to do with anything? What did you find? I found the medical truth, Joanne. The real medical truth that Cameron spent years hiding from you, from me, and apparently from Ashley. I found the heavily redacted expense reports billed to a private offshore account. I found the emails sent to highly discreet specialists. I found the actual clinical reports that your perfect son buried so deeply he thought they would never see the light of day. I watched the color completely drain from her face. She was finally starting to understand that the next few minutes were going to rewrite her entire existence. The genetic boast she had clung to so desperately was about to become the very thing that destroyed her. You love talking about genetics, Joanne, I whispered, leaning in close enough that she could feel the chill of my words. You love bragging about his bloodline. But what you are about to learn is going to make you wish you had never walked into this hospital today. You are bluffing! Joanne hissed, her voice trembling as she desperately tried to pivot away from the medical threat I had just hung over her head. She gripped the strings of her balloon bouquet so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. You are just throwing out wild accusations because you want to ruin this day. You want to sound dangerous, but you are just the same pathetic girl who had a nervous breakdown when her husband realized he deserved better. Cameron left you because you lost your mind, and Ashley was there to pick up the pieces. I let out a sound that was half sigh and half laugh. It was a cold, hollow noise that made Joanne flinch. Lost my mind. I repeated, testing the words on my tongue. Is that the story he told you, Joanne? Or is that the story you helped him craft so you could justify replacing me with my own best friend? You love to talk about how Ashley picked up the pieces, but we both know she was the one holding the hammer. Joanne lifted her chin, attempting to summon her old aristocratic superiority. Ashley loved him. She saw how miserable you made him with your coldness and your constant working. They fell in love organically. It was a beautiful thing born out of your failure to be a proper wife. I took a slow step forward, cutting off her escape route toward the elevator. Organically. That is a fascinating word for a premeditated home invasion. Let me tell you exactly how organic their romance was. Let me tell you about the second week of November 3 years ago. Joanne's eyes darted nervously, but she was trapped. She could not walk away without looking like a coward, and her ego simply would not allow that. It was a rainy Tuesday night, I continued, my voice dropping to a surgical precision. Cameron was asleep. He had come home late, claiming he was exhausted from closing a massive logistics account. I was in his home office looking for a specific tax document in his leather briefcase. I accidentally knocked the briefcase off the chair, and a secret zippered compartment spilled open. A cheap prepaid burner phone fell out onto the rug. I paused, watching the defiant mask on Joanne's face begin to crack. He was not as smart as he thought he was, I said. He used the same passcode for everything. I unlocked it, and I read every single message. I did not find them in bed, Joanne. I found something much worse. I found a detailed, systematic blueprint of how they planned to destroy my sanity. Joanne swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet lounge. They were just venting. You drove him to it. They were not venting, I corrected, my tone sharpening into a blade. Ashley was my maid of honor. She was the woman who sat on my sofa drinking my wine, wiping my tears when I cried about my fertility struggles. And on that phone, I read a message she sent to Cameron while she was sitting in my living room. She typed, "Make sure she feels like the hostility is her fault. Tell her she is acting paranoid. I want that house, Cameron, but I absolutely hate her taste in curtains. We need her out by Christmas." I stepped so close to Joanne I could see the fine layers of foundation caking in the creases of her panicked face. Your perfect son replied to her, saying, "Do not worry, baby. I am slowly convincing her that she is losing her grip on reality. I am moving her keys, hiding her documents, and telling her she is forgetting things. She will check herself into a facility before the holidays and the house will be ours. Joanne took a sharp breath, stumbling backward. No, Cameron is a good boy. He would never do something so sinister. You are making this up to make him sound like a monster. He is a monster, Joanne, I stated flatly. And you are the one who raised him. But the apple truly does not fall far from the tree, does it? Because when the divorce finally happened, you did not just support his new relationship. You orchestrated a masterclass in social manipulation to ensure I was completely obliterated from Chicago society. She stood up straighter, trying to reclaim her righteous indignation. I simply protected my son. I told our friends the truth about your instability. You launched a smear campaign that would make a political operative blush, I countered. You hosted that lavish champagne brunch at the country club just 3 days after Cameron served me with papers. You invited every single woman in our social circle. You sat at the head of the table, dabbing your eyes with a linen napkin, and spun a beautiful, tragic tale about your poor son. You told them I was unhinged. You told them I was prone to violent outbursts, and that Cameron had to leave for his own safety. You painted Ashley as the nurturing savior who rescued him from my toxic ambition. I watched her face carefully, noting the exact moment guilt tried to surface before she quickly shoved it down. You called the charity boards I sat on, I continued relentlessly. You whispered to the committee chairs that I was mentally unfit to handle the gala funds. You systematically burned every bridge I had built in this city, laying out a pristine red carpet for Ashley to step right into my shoes. She took my husband. She took my social standing. She took my home. And you stood on the sidelines cheering while they ripped my life apart. Joanne scoffed a harsh, ugly sound. And it worked, did it not? You ran away with your tail between your legs. You packed a single suitcase and vanished like a coward. You did not fight for your marriage. You did not fight for your house. You just surrendered because you knew I was right. You knew you did not belong in our world. I let out a low, dark laugh that made the hairs on Joanne's arms stand up. She looked at me as if she was seeing a ghost, as if the woman she thought she broke had been replaced by something entirely unrecognizable. You really think I walked out of that house with one suitcase because I was weak? I asked, my voice echoing off the glass walls. You think I surrendered? I leaned in, my eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. I did not walk away out of cowardice, Joanne. I walked away because fighting a pig in the mud only gets you dirty, and the pig likes it. If I had stayed and fought a messy, drawn-out legal war over that house, Cameron would have hired aggressive lawyers. He would have scrutinized my accounts. He would have paid attention. I walked away in absolute silence because I needed him to think he had won. I needed him comfortable. I needed him arrogant. She stared at me, her lips parting in silent horror as the pieces began to align in her mind. I handed him that house because I knew he could not actually afford the property taxes and the upkeep without my salary. I explained, peeling back the layers of my strategy. I gave him the social circle because those people were superficial parasites who would drain his wallet dry with their expectations. I packed one single suitcase because material things are entirely replaceable, but the element of surprise is priceless. I turned and paced a few steps away, letting the silence amplify my words, before spinning back to face her. I left quietly to build the guillotine you are currently standing under, Joanne. I spent 3 years plotting my next move while you and Cameron were busy popping champagne and celebrating your stolen victory. I needed him to feel so untouchable, so invincible, that he would eventually do something incredibly stupid. I needed him to steal. I needed him to commit federal fraud just to keep up the appearance of the wealthy lifestyle you and Ashley demanded from him. Joanne's breathing was ragged now, her chest heaving under her cashmere coat. You are a psychopath, she whispered, her voice shaking with genuine fear. You let him ruin his life just to get back at me. I did not make him steal millions of dollars from his venture capital investors, I corrected sharply. I did not make him root corporate funds to pay for your luxury handbag or this absurd hospital suite. I just sat back and watched him dig his own grave. And when the hole was deep enough, I bought the graveyard. She looked frantically toward the elevator, as if hoping her son would magically appear and save her from the monster standing in front of her. But the numbers above the elevator doors remained dark. "You think you are so clever, Chelsea," she stammered, trying to summon one last ounce of defiance. "You think auditing his company gives you all the power. But he still has a family. He still has a son. That baby upstairs proves that he moved on and created a beautiful life while you sat in the shadows obsessing over him." I smiled, the cold, predatory expression returning to my face. The absolute certainty in her voice when she mentioned that baby was almost pitiful. She was clinging to the very anchor that was about to pull her straight to the bottom of the ocean. "You keep bringing up that baby, Joanne," I said, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You keep talking about strong genetics and biological legacies. It is fascinating how much of your pride is wrapped up in a child you know absolutely nothing about." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her grip on the balloon bouquet slipping slightly. "He is Cameron's son. He looks exactly like him." I took a slow breath, letting the weight of the moment settle over the room. "Before you start planning the family portraits, Joanne, you might want to ask yourself a very basic biological question. When a man is completely 100% sterile, how exactly does his wife get pregnant?" Joanne froze. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. The arrogant matriarch who had strutted into the lounge minutes ago was gone, replaced by a woman staring down the barrel of total annihilation. Joanne stood completely paralyzed as the silence in the VIP lounge stretched into a suffocating vacuum. The arrogant matriarch who had strutted into the hospital just moments ago was gone, replaced by a woman staring down the barrel of total annihilation. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving her skin a stark ashen gray against the bright collar of her cashmere coat. Her eyes darted wildly around the room as if searching for an emergency exit, or a friendly face to rescue her from the nightmare unfolding before her. But there was no one else here. It was just the two of us and the devastating truth I had just laid bare. For a long moment I thought she might faint. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and the grip she had on the balloon bouquet slipped, causing the shiny blue foil to bob awkwardly against the ceiling tiles. I stood perfectly still, projecting an aura of absolute calm. I knew exactly what was happening in her mind. The human brain possesses an incredible capacity for denial, especially when confronted with information that threatens to destroy its entire foundation. Joanne had built her entire identity around her son's perfection and her own perceived superiority. Accepting that Cameron was medically sterile meant accepting that her grand biological legacy was a complete fabrication. It meant acknowledging that she had tormented me over a biological failing that actually belonged to her golden child. Suddenly the shock seemed to fracture, and Joanne let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. It was a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the glass walls of the waiting area, completely devoid of genuine humor. She shook her head violently, her manicured hands fluttering in the air as she frantically tried to rebuild the walls of her delusion. "You really are sick, Chelsea!" She spat, her voice trembling with a mix of panic and forced outrage. "You are genuinely out of your mind. I should have known you would stoop to making up disgusting medical lies just to hurt us. You cannot stand the fact that Cameron moved on and found a real woman. You cannot stand that he is thriving while you are clearly obsessed with him. You are just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause a scene because your own life is so empty." She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest as she desperately attempted to reclaim her shattered dignity. She was pivoting, retreating to the only battlefield she thought she could win. She was returning to the shield of corporate success and financial status. "You want to talk about reality?" she demanded, her tone rising in a frantic crescendo. "Let us talk about reality. Cameron is a vice president at a major tech firm now. He is a prominent executive at Nexus Logistics. He manages massive teams and handles multi-million-dollar accounts. He is a provider, Chelsea, a true provider who takes care of his family. He has a gorgeous home, a beautiful wife, and a lucrative career. He is respected and powerful." She took a step forward, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "You held him back. You, with your exhausting ambition and your constant demands. You drained the life out of him. The moment he dropped your dead weight, his career skyrocketed. He became the man he was always destined to be. You can stand there in your nice little blazer and throw around auditing terms to sound important, but you are nothing compared to him. He built an empire. You are just a jealous woman grasping at straws because you know you lost. I did not interrupt her. I let her speak, allowing her to expend her frantic energy. I observed the beads of sweat forming along her hairline and the way her jaw clenched with nervous tension. She was projecting so hard it was almost tragic. She needed me to be jealous. She needed me to be the broken, discarded woman because if I was not, then her entire reality was a lie. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, her chest heaving under her expensive coat, I simply tilted my head and offered her a soft, pitying smile. That smile did more damage than any insult I could have hurled at her. It told her that her words had absolutely no power over me. It told her that she was screaming at a brick wall. An empire. Joanne? I repeated, keeping my voice deliberately low and smooth. You think Cameron built an empire? You think a mid-level vice president title at a tech startup makes him a king? It is fascinating how easily you are blinded by a fancy business card and a leased luxury vehicle. You have always been so easily impressed by the illusion of wealth that you never bothered to check if the foundation was made of sand. I took a slow, measured step toward her, closing the distance between us. The faint scent of her floral perfume mingled with the sterile hospital air, creating a cloying, sickeningly sweet atmosphere. She tried to hold her ground, but her eyes betrayed her rising panic. You love to talk about Nexus Logistics. I continued, my gaze locking onto hers with unyielding intensity. You love to throw that company name around at your country club luncheons, acting as if your son is the next great visionary of the tech world. You think his position there makes him untouchable. You think it makes him a provider. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, forcing her to hang on my next words. I know exactly what Cameron does at Nexus Logistics, Joanne. I know what time he logs into the server every morning. I know which client accounts he pretends to manage. I know how much time he spends playing golf on company hours while claiming to be in executive strategy meetings. I know every single detail about his fraudulent little corporate existence. Her eyes narrowed defensively. You do not know anything about his job. You are just an auditor. You look at spreadsheets. You do not understand executive leadership. I let out a soft, chilling laugh. I understand executive leadership better than you could possibly imagine, Joanne. And I understand Nexus Logistics better than your son ever did. I do not just look at their spreadsheets. I do not just audit their accounts. I stepped so close to her that I could see the dilated pupils of her eyes. I know exactly what Cameron does at Nexus Logistics because my firm just bought them. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. I watched them land. I watched them register in her mind, tearing through her defenses like a wrecking ball. The smug, defiant expression she had been trying so desperately to maintain faltered, and then completely collapsed. Her mouth fell open, forming a silent shape of absolute shock. Your firm, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital ventilation system. Yes, Joanne, I replied, my tone ringing with undeniable authority. My firm, the forensic auditing and corporate restructuring firm that I built from the ground up over the last 3 years. The firm that partnered with Alexander Sterling, the billionaire head of Vanguard Venture Capital. We did not just audit Nexus Logistics. We evaluated it, stripped it down to its studs, and acquired a controlling interest in the company. I watched her knees visibly buckle. She reached out blindly and grabbed the edge of a nearby leather waiting chair, lowering herself into it before she could completely collapse. The shiny blue balloons bobbed aggressively as her hands shook. That is impossible, she stammered, shaking her head. Cameron would have known. Cameron would have told me. Cameron is an arrogant fool, I corrected sharply. He has no idea who holds the purse strings. He was too busy embezzling funds and planning his fake paternity leave to pay attention to the restructuring documents he was blindly signing. He thought the venture capital group was just bringing in standard third-party consultants. He never bothered to look at the name of the managing partner on the acquisition paperwork. If he had, he would have seen my signature right next to Alexander's. I looked down at her sitting slumped in the chair, all her aristocratic pretensions stripped away. She looked small-old and thoroughly defeated. The shift in power was complete and absolute. She had walked into this room believing she held the ultimate victory. She believed she could crush me with the news of a baby and a successful son. Instead, she was sitting in a hospital lounge realizing that the woman she had abused and discarded was now the ultimate master of her son's fate. "You own it," she murmured, her eyes wide with a terror that was entirely genuine. "You own his company. I own his company." I confirmed, my voice echoing with a cold, hard finality. "I own his office. I own his corporate accounts. I own the server that houses all his miserable little secrets. I own the very desk he sits at when he pretends to be a successful provider. And most importantly, Joanne, I own the evidence of every single stolen dollar he took to buy you that ridiculous handbag." She looked down at the luxury leather bag in her lap as if it had suddenly caught fire. She pulled her hands away from it, resting them weakly on her knees. I checked my watch, the heavy diamond-studded timepiece catching the light from the overhead fixtures. "5 minutes left, Joanne," I said, my voice slicing through her panic. "5 minutes until the illusion shatters completely. You thought you could come over here and gloat. You thought you could rub my face in a life you helped steal from me. But you did not realize that I have spent 3 years becoming the architect of your destruction." I leaned down, placing my hands on the armrests of her chair, trapping her in place. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, preparing to dismantle the rest of her reality piece by piece. "We are done talking about his fake job, Joanne. Now we are going to talk about the fallout. We are going to talk about what happens when the federal agents waiting in the lobby downstairs come up to that expensive maternity suite. We are going to talk about what happens when the real father of that baby walks through those elevator doors. Because your perfect son is not just losing his job today, he is losing his freedom, his marriage, and his entire fake legacy all at once. And you get a front row seat to the execution." Joanne gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath in the sterile room. How she rasped, her voice cracking under the sheer impossibility of my statement. "How could you possibly do that? You were a mid-level marketing manager. You had nothing when you left our house. You left with a single piece of luggage. You are lying." I watched her mind short-circuit as it tried to process the total destruction of her perceived reality. "You truly believed my silence was weakness, Joanne. You believed that I was simply a broken woman crawling away to lick her wounds. You thought you had won a total victory, but you fundamentally misunderstood who I am and what I am capable of achieving. When I walked out of that house with my single suitcase, I did not go to a luxury hotel and cry myself to sleep. I rented a tiny, damp studio apartment with zero furniture. I sat on the bare hardwood floor with my laptop illuminated only by the streetlights outside my window. I realized in that dark, empty room that the only reason Cameron could manipulate me, the only reason you could belittle me at every family gathering, was because I lacked leverage. I lacked the absolute financial power required to dictate my own terms. So I made a vow to acquire that power at any cost. I did not just recover from the divorce, Joanne. I weaponized the trauma you and your son inflicted on me. I took every ounce of grief, every drop of humiliation from your Sunday dinners, every cruel comment about my career and my body, and I forged it into an unstoppable ambition. I went back to school online while working 80-hour weeks in corporate finance. I studied late into the night, analyzing complex balance sheets and legal frameworks until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I acquired my certified fraud examiner credentials with perfect scores. I transformed myself into a forensic auditor. While you and Cameron were busy playing house with Ashley, taking extravagant vacations, and posting photos of your perfect fake life, I was dissecting corporate financial structures. I learned how to track hidden offshore assets. I learned how to identify sophisticated shell companies designed to launder money. I learned how to dismantle corrupt executives piece by piece, exposing their greed to the harsh light of day. I built a consultancy from the ground up, specializing in high-stakes corporate restructuring and fraud detection. I refuse to let men like your son intimidate me ever again. I became the person billionaire investors and venture capitalists call when they want to know if the company they are acquiring is a legitimate gold mine or a fraudulent graveyard. I became an apex predator in a corporate world run by arrogant, mediocre men who think they are untouchable. Men exactly like Cameron. My reputation became my armor, and my intellect became my weapon. I let the anger burn hot and bright, using it as fuel to propel my agency to the top of the industry. Within 2 years, my firm was securing multi-million-dollar contracts. We were exposing white-collar criminals and saving venture capitalists from making catastrophic investments. I did not need your son's fake wealth because I was generating real, undeniable power. Joanne swallowed hard, her throat visibly clicking as the reality of my transformation settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She gripped the arms of the leather chair, her perfectly manicured nails digging fiercely into the upholstery. But Nexus Logistics is a massive startup, she protested weakly, her voice trembling with rising panic. They are valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. You could not possibly have the capital to acquire them alone. You are just a consultant. You do not have that kind of money. I do not operate alone anymore, Joanne, I explained, taking a slow, predatory step to my right to block her view of the hallway. I aligned myself with people who deal in actual wealth, not the least luxury cars and leveraged mortgages your son uses to impress your superficial country club friends. 6 months ago, my forensic auditing firm was retained by Vanguard Venture Capital. They are an absolute titan in the tech investment industry, and they were preparing to execute a massive acquisition. They had their sights set on a highly promising logistics tech startup that claimed to be revolutionizing global supply chain algorithms. That startup was Nexus Logistics. Vanguard was preparing to offer an acquisition buyout in the 9 figures. It was a deal that would make the founders and upper management incredibly wealthy overnight. But Alexander Sterling, the billionaire head of Vanguard, does not spend a single dime without a flawless forensic audit. He is ruthless, brilliant, and entirely unforgiving when it comes to financial discrepancies. He hired my firm to gut Nexus Logistics financially before he signed the term sheets. He gave me unrestricted God-level access to every financial record, every vendor contract, every internal communication channel, and every encrypted server Nexus operated. We were tasked with finding any liabilities, any hidden debts, any bloated executive compensation packages, or pending lawsuits that might threaten the acquisition. It was supposed to be a standard routine corporate audit, a simple 6-week deep dive to verify their profit margins and ensure the investment was sound. We deployed our proprietary tracking software to monitor every cent flowing in and out of the Nexus accounts. I personally oversaw the deployment because a deal of this magnitude required my direct supervision. I sat in my glass-walled office overlooking the city, examining the financial architecture of the very company your son claimed to rule. I had the entire fate of Nexus Logistics resting in the palm of my hand, and the executives had no idea they were being monitored by a ghost. We combed through years of data, analyzing every wire transfer and expense report, searching for anomalies. But the universe has a funny way of delivering absolute poetic justice. I continued, my voice echoing softly against the glass walls of the VIP lounge. When my team initiated the data extraction, I started reviewing the executive hierarchy. I was looking for the usual red flags: arrogant founders, careless spending, inflated expense accounts, and inappropriate vendor relationships. The CEO and co-founder, a man named Jason, was exactly what I expected. A tech bro with a god complex, who thought the rules did not apply to him and who viewed corporate funds as his personal playground. I flagged his accounts immediately for deeper review. But then I pulled up the organizational chart to review the vice president of operations. And there, staring back at me from the glowing high-resolution screen of my monitor, was the smiling, perfectly polished face of my ex-husband, Cameron. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of that coincidence hang in the tense air between us. Joanne's eyes were wide pools of terror. Her breathing had become incredibly shallow and rapid. She was trembling visibly now, her designer coat doing nothing to ward off the chill of my words. Her reality was fracturing, and I was holding the hammer. Can you imagine the sheer exhilarating justice of that moment, Joanne? I asked softly, leaning in closer. Out of all the tech startups in the country, out of all the executives I could have been assigned to investigate, fate dropped Cameron right onto my desk. He was a ghost in the machine, a name on a digital ledger, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman he had discarded was currently holding the master key to his entire professional existence. I sat in my office staring at his digital footprint, feeling a profound sense of destiny. I watched his daily login times. I read his private emails to Jason. I saw the sheer, unadulterated arrogance dripping from his corporate communications. He spoke to his subordinates like they were garbage. He expensed lavish lunches and claimed they were critical client meetings. He operated with the exact same unearned superiority he used to display in our marriage. He thought he was a king presiding over an untouchable empire. He thought his secrets were safely hidden behind corporate firewalls and non-disclosure agreements. But looking at his data, looking at the raw, unfiltered truth of his financial habits, I immediately noticed the discrepancies. The numbers simply did not align with his actual salary. The math was wrong. And when the math is wrong, Joanne, it means someone is hiding something. It means someone is stealing. The more I dug, the more I realized that your perfect son was not just a terrible husband. He was a reckless, careless criminal who was leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs a mile wide. And I knew in that exact moment that I was going to tear his life apart piece by piece until nothing remained but ash. I watched the last remnants of color drain from Joanne's face as the gravity of my words settled over her. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. She simply clutched her stolen leather bag, her knuckles stark white, her breath rattling in her chest. I did not offer her a moment to recover. I stepped closer, closing the distance until I was looking down at her trapped form. You see, Joanne, financial fraud is an art form when done correctly. I began, my voice smooth and clinical. But your son is not an artist. He is a greedy, desperate amateur playing dress-up with someone else's money. When Vanguard Venture Capital injected $50 million of seed funding into Nexus Logistics, they expected that capital to be used for server expansion, software development, and legitimate operational scaling. They trusted the executive team to act as fiduciaries. But Cameron looked at that massive influx of cash and saw nothing but a personal slush fund to finance the life he thought he deserved. I paced slowly in front of her chair, detailing the exact mechanics of his crimes. The operation was remarkably lazy, I explained, keeping my tone conversational yet dripping with contempt. He set up 3 separate dummy corporations registered in Delaware. He named them abstract corporate things like Apex Consulting, Horizon Logistics Solutions, and Meridian Tech Partners. He then generated highly inflated invoices for phantom services, marketing consultation software, stress testing, supply chain optimization, and routed those invoices directly through his department. Because he was the vice president of operations, he had the authorization to sign off on any vendor expense under $500,000 without triggering an immediate board review. He approved his own fake invoices and wired the venture capital funds straight into his offshore accounts. Joanne shook her head vehemently, her perfect blowout bouncing erratically. No, she gasped, her voice thin and reedy. No, he earns a massive salary. He has stock options. He is a brilliant executive. He does not need to steal. You are twisting standard business practices to make him look guilty because you hate us. I let out a soft, sharp laugh that made her flinch. Standard business practices, I echoed. Do you honestly believe a legitimate technology executive pays for his mother's country club membership using a corporate vendor account registered in the Cayman Islands? She froze, her eyes darting away from mine. Oh yes, Joanne, I know all about the Oak Brook Country Club. I continued, leaning in so she could hear every crisp syllable. I know that your pristine reputation among those snobby old money socialites is entirely funded by wire fraud. You love playing the wealthy matriarch, do you not? You love hosting those lavish charity luncheons, acting as if your family possesses generations of accumulated wealth. But I pulled the transaction logs. On the 3rd of February, Cameron wired $85,000 from the Horizon Logistics Solutions dummy account directly to Oakbrook to cover your initiation fee and your premium tier annual dues. He categorized it on the Nexus corporate ledger as a regional networking and client acquisition expense. Joanna's mouth trembled. Her eyes were wide with a terror that was deeply satisfying to witness. She tried to push herself further back into the leather chair, as if she could merge with the upholstery and disappear from the room. He told me it was a gift. She stammered defensively, clinging to a fragile thread of denial. He told me he received a massive performance bonus and wanted to treat his mother. He is a good son. He wanted me to enjoy my retirement. He bought your affection with stolen money, I corrected sharply, just like he bought his fake lifestyle with Ashley. Let us talk about that beautiful new Mercedes-Benz you drove here today. The gleaming silver S-Class parked in the VIP structure downstairs. You love driving it to your salon appointments, waving at your friends. But did Cameron tell you that the lease is registered to a corporate account flagged for federal investigation? On the 12th of April, he authorized a down payment of $42,000 using funds siphoned from the Nexus server expansion budget. He literally stole money meant to upgrade the company infrastructure so his mother could look rich driving down the magnificent mile. She squeezed her eyes shut, her head shaking back and forth. "Stop it," she whimpered. "Stop making up these lies. I will not listen to this. I will not let you ruin my son's reputation. You are going to listen to every single word, Joanne, I commanded, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register that forced her to open her eyes and look at me. You are going to sit there and face the absolute truth of what your son is. Because the cars and the country clubs were just the beginning. I gestured upward toward the ceiling, toward the maternity ward where her precious son was currently holding court. Do you know how much this specific hospital charges for their premier VIP maternity suite? I asked. It is a very exclusive package. Personal chefs, private nurses, luxury linens, and absolute privacy. It costs roughly $12,000 a night. Cameron booked it for 4 nights. He told you he wanted Ashley to have the best possible care because she is the mother of his child. He told you he was providing for his family. Joanne's chest heaved as she struggled to draw breath. He is providing. He takes care of his wife. He wired $48,000 to Chicago General Hospital from the Apex Consulting fraudulent account on the 22nd of September. I stated my tone clinical and utterly devoid of mercy. I have the exact transaction hash, Joanne. I have the routing numbers. I have the digital signature matching Cameron's IP address at the Nexus office. The very bed Ashley is sleeping in right now, the gourmet meals she is eating, the nurses attending to her every whim, are all entirely paid for by stolen venture capital funds. The birth of your supposedly perfect grandson is being financed by federal wire fraud. She let out a strangled sob, her carefully maintained facade completely shattering. The arrogance, the superiority, the malicious joy she had walked into this room with were completely eradicated. She was left with nothing but the terrifying realization that her entire world was built on a foundation of massive criminal liability. I refused to let her look away. I stepped even closer, ensuring she felt the full, suffocating weight of my presence. "You called me a failure, Joanne," I reminded her, keeping my gaze locked onto her panicked eyes. "You said leaving me was the best decision your son ever made. You thought he traded up. You thought he discarded a broken woman for a shiny new life. But the truth is he was just too weak and too mediocre to survive a marriage with a woman who demanded actual integrity. Ashley was the perfect target for him. She is greedy, superficial, and completely willing to look the other way as long as the designer bags and the luxury vacations keep coming. She never asked where the money came from because she simply did not care." Joanne raised a trembling hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the ragged breaths tearing through her throat. "You cannot prove any of this," she choked out, offering one final pathetic attempt at denial. "You are just throwing numbers around. Cameron will hire lawyers. He will destroy you in court. He will tell the judge you fabricated all this data because you are a scorned ex-wife. I let out a harsh laugh, shaking my head at her sheer delusion. Do you honestly think a billionaire like Alexander Sterling executes a nine-figure acquisition based on the unverified claims of a scorned ex-wife? I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. Do you think federal agents authorize arrest warrants without absolute ironclad digital proof? I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved my smartphone, unlocking the screen with a swift swipe. I did not just find the transactions, Joanne. I secured them. I downloaded the entire server history. I traced the IP addresses. I subpoenaed the offshore bank records. I handed the FBI a perfectly wrapped, unassailable package of evidence detailing exactly how your son committed 57 counts of wire fraud over the past 2 years. I held the phone up so she could see the screen displaying a heavily encrypted dashboard of forensic data. I began reading directly from the audit report, my voice ringing through the quiet lounge with the force of a gavel striking wood. August 4th, wire transfer of $250,000 to a Cayman Islands holding company signed by Cameron. September 9th, wire transfer of $175,000 to a fraudulent vendor in Cyprus signed by Cameron. November 2nd, withdrawal of $90,000 for a down payment on a luxury condo in Ashley's name funded by stolen corporate assets. Should I continue, Joanne? I have 300 pages of this. I have every dinner, every vacation, every piece of jewelry he bought to construct this pathetic fantasy life you have all been living. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, crying openly now. The tears ruined her expensive makeup, leaving dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. She was not crying for me. She was not feeling remorse for the years of psychological torture she had subjected me to. She was crying for herself. She was mourning the sudden violent death of her country club status and her stolen luxury. The reality was finally taking root in her mind. She could no longer hide behind the illusion of her son's success. The exact dates, the precise dollar amounts, the undeniable digital footprint left zero room for doubt. Cameron was not a brilliant executive. He was a thief who was caught red-handed by the very woman he thought he had destroyed. Your entire life is a crime scene, Joanne, I whispered, stepping back and letting her drown in her own panic. Every piece of clothing you are wearing, every luxury you enjoy, every ounce of pride you feel is bought with stolen money. Your son did not step up into true manhood. He stepped straight into a federal indictment. And you applauded him every step of the way. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the impending doom hovering over the hospital. Joanne's sobs were the only sound in the room, raw and pathetic. But I was not finished. The financial devastation was only the precursor to the final blow. I had destroyed her illusions of wealth, but she still clung desperately to the one biological prize she thought she had won. You clung to that baby the moment you walked into this lounge, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You held up those ridiculous balloons like a shield. You genuinely believe that no matter what crimes your son committed, at least he gave you a biological heir to carry on your precious family name. You thought this child was your ultimate victory over me. Joanne sniffled, clutching the balloon strings tighter. The plastic rubbed together, making a desperate squeaking sound. He did, she rasped, her voice wet with tears and panic. You can take the cars and the house, but you cannot take my grandson. He is Cameron's blood. He is our family. Ashley gave us what you never could. I shook my head slowly, savoring the delicious irony of her absolute delusion. The sheer magnitude of her blindness was almost breathtaking. When you execute a forensic audit on a corrupt company, you have to follow every single thread I explained, pacing slowly back and forth across the polished marble floor. Cameron was not the only executive treating Nexus Logistics like a personal bank account. Jason, his co-founder, was equally arrogant and twice as reckless. I had to audit Jason's private communications on the company server to trace the secondary authorization signatures on Cameron's wire transfers. I spent weeks reading through Jason's digital footprint. I sifted through his private emails, his direct messages, and his executive expense reports. Jason thought he was brilliant. He thought encrypting a single folder on a hidden partition of the corporate drive would keep his secrets safe from the board of directors. But encryption is just a puzzle. Joanne and I am exceptionally good at solving puzzles. I cracked the folder open late one Thursday night. I continued keeping my gaze locked onto her terrified eyes. I expected to find evidence of insider trading, or perhaps illegal kickbacks from international vendors. I thought I would find the standard corporate corruption that plagues startups run by mediocre men. What I actually found was a deeply personal file that Jason had meticulously maintained. It contained dozens of heavily redacted expense reports. They were submitted to the accounting department under the incredibly vague category of executive health and wellness retention. The amounts were staggering. We are talking about tens of thousands of dollars being funneled out of the corporate accounts every single month, disguised as legitimate business costs. Joanne's breathing hitched. She wiped a streak of ruined mascara from her cheek, trying to project a semblance of defiance despite her trembling hands. So Jason was stealing too, she stammered, attempting to redirect the focus. What does that have to do with my grandson? You are just trying to confuse me with corporate jargon. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of her, forcing her to look up at me. The money was not going to a luxury spa or a private golf retreat, Joanne. I traced the routing numbers on those redacted invoices. The funds were being wired directly to the Sterling Institute of Reproductive Medicine. It is the most exclusive private fertility clinic in downtown Chicago. She blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to connect the dots. A fertility clinic, she repeated, her voice completely hollow. Yes, I confirmed smoothly, watching the realization slowly begin to dawn on her. Now, why would a tech startup be paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to a private fertility clinic? I looked at the dates on those invoices, Joanne. The payments began exactly 9 months ago. They perfectly align with the exact timeline of Ashley's miraculous sudden pregnancy. Joanne let out a frantic breath, her eyes widening as she grabbed onto a false lifeline. So Cameron used corporate funds to pay for Ashley's in vitro fertilization, she reasoned, her voice rising with desperate hope. He paid for the best doctors to make sure they could conceive. That just proves how much he wanted a family. It just proves he was willing to do whatever it took to give me a grandchild. He wanted to be a father so badly he broke the rules. I looked at her with genuine pity. It is truly remarkable how your mind will bend over backward to protect your ego, I whispered. You are so desperate to be right that you cannot see the massive glaring hole in your own logic. You are willing to accept that your son is a federal criminal as long as you get to keep your precious biological legacy. I did not stop at the routing numbers. I said, my tone sharpening into a lethal weapon. I am a forensic auditor, Joanne. I do not deal in assumptions. I do not deal in guesses or hopeful theories. I deal in absolute verifiable data. I took the billing reference codes from those corporate invoices, and I breached the clinic's patient portal. It was highly illegal, but perfectly justified given the circumstances. I pulled the unredacted clinical reports. I wanted to see exactly what Cameron and Ashley were billing to the company. Joanna's hands began to shake violently. The mylar balloons crinkled loudly in the quiet room as her grip spasmed uncontrollably. The files I uncovered were not just for standard IVF procedures. I stated, pronouncing every word with deliberate, devastating clarity. They included comprehensive male fertility diagnostics. And the most fascinating part, Joanne, was that the initial diagnostic reports were not from 9 months ago. They were dated 4 years ago. They were generated during the exact same timeline when you and I were sitting in your dining room. The exact same timeline when you were forcing me to drink your bitter herbal teas and telling our entire extended family that my womb was a hostile environment. No, she gasped, shrinking back into the leather chair, as if my words were physically striking her. Yes, I countered, stepping closer until my shadow completely engulfed her. I read the medical reports, Joanne. I read the detailed analysis from the top reproductive endocrinologist in the state. 4 years ago, while I was injecting myself with synthetic hormones and enduring agonizing surgeries, your perfect, successful son was sitting in a private clinic receiving his own test results. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was nearly unbearable. I wanted her to feel the full weight of the destruction about to land on her head. Cameron is sterile, Joanne. He is completely, irreversibly, 100% sterile. He has a genetic microdeletion that makes it biologically impossible for him to ever father a child. The words slammed into her like a freight train. She let out a guttural choking sound, clapping both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. Her eyes bulged with a terror so profound it almost looked like madness. She stared at me, shaking her head frantically side to side, unable to process the total annihilation of her reality. He knew. I continued, my voice rising slightly, carrying the weight of years of unjustified shame and trauma. He knew the entire time. While you were humiliating me at Sunday dinners, he knew. While I was crying on the bathroom floor surrounded by negative tests, he knew. He watched me break myself into pieces, trying to fix a problem that belonged entirely to him. He let me take the blame because his fragile, pathetic ego could not handle the truth. He was so terrified of looking like less of a man in front of his wealthy, successful friends and his overbearing mother that he gladly let me suffer. Joanne shook her head wildly, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face in a tangled mess. "You are lying!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You are making this up to destroy us. He is the father." Ashley was pregnant. She just gave birth to his son. I smiled, a cold, merciless expression that finally shattered the last remaining piece of her delusion. Ashley just gave birth to a son, I agreed smoothly. But he is not Cameron's son, Joanne. Cameron is biologically incapable of producing an heir. The genetic legacy you have been bragging about for the last 20 minutes is a complete biological impossibility. You spent the last 3 years celebrating a pregnancy that has absolutely zero connection to your bloodline. Your son is a fraud in the boardroom, and he is a fraud in the maternity ward. Joanne slumped forward, burying her face in her hands as harsh, racking sobs tore through her body. The realization had finally broken through her defenses. The empire of lies her son had built was collapsing directly on top of her. The money was gone. The prestige was gone. And the biological grandson she viewed as her ultimate triumph was nothing but a ghost. She wept openly, her shoulders shaking with the violent force of her shattered reality. I watched her cry, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound clinical satisfaction. The woman who had spent years making me feel worthless was now drowning in her own humiliation. It was the purest form of justice I had ever experienced. But who, she gasped, lifting her tear-streaked face to look at me with desperate, pleading eyes. If Cameron is sterile, then whose baby is it? Who is the father? I checked my watch again, watching the second hand complete its final revolution. Right on time, I whispered, stepping back and turning my attention to the polished steel doors of the main elevator bank. The wait is finally over, Joanne. Your answers have arrived. The soft chime of the elevator echoed down the corridor, but Joanne violently rejected the impending reality before her. "No," she shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat like a wounded animal. She scrambled backward in the leather-waiting chair, putting physical distance between herself and the truth I had just dropped on her. "You are a liar, Chelsea. You are a sick, twisted, jealous liar. You fabricated this entire sick story because you cannot stand to see my son happy. You could not give him a child, so now you want to pretend he is the broken one." She gripped the handles of her expensive handbag so fiercely her joints looked ready to snap. Her chest heaved under her designer coat, and her perfectly styled hair was now messy and disheveled. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "I know what you are doing," she spat, her voice shrill and desperate. "You hacked into a few corporate accounts and decided to play God. You probably forged some fake medical documents just to torture me. But I am not stupid. I know my son. Cameron is a perfectly healthy, virile man. Ashley is a loyal, beautiful wife. You are just a bitter ex-wife trying to inflict psychological trauma because nobody wants you. You are trying to destroy the most joyous day of my life." Joanne continued, her volume rising as she tried to shout down her own internal panic. "You want me to doubt my own bloodline. You want me to look at my beautiful newborn grandson and see a stranger. It is not going to work. Do you hear me? I will not let your toxic, jealous delusions poison my family. I am going upstairs right now, and I am going to hold my grandson." And then I am going to tell Cameron to call his lawyers and have you thrown in prison for corporate espionage and harassment." I did not interrupt her frantic tirade. I stood perfectly still, allowing her to expend the very last reserves of her manufactured superiority. She was thrashing wildly against the truth, fighting a war that was already lost. I let the silence stretch out after her shouting subsided until the only sound in the room was her ragged, desperate breathing. "Are you finished, Joanne?" I asked, my voice remaining completely flat and devoid of emotion. "Because your denial does not change the data. It just makes your inevitable collapse that much more pathetic to watch." I reached into my leather briefcase and slowly retrieved my tablet. The sleek metal device felt heavy with the weight of absolute destruction. I tapped the screen, illuminating the dark display, and authenticated my biometric login. I did not rush. I took my time opening the highly encrypted forensic file I had compiled specifically for this exact moment. I wanted her to feel the agonizing anticipation. I wanted her to watch the exact weapon of her execution being unsheathed. I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance until I was standing directly over her seated form. I turned the glowing screen of the tablet around so it was perfectly positioned at her eye level. There was nowhere for her to look except directly at the undeniable proof of her son's absolute failure. "Look at the screen, Joanne," I commanded, my tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "Read the official letterhead. That is not a forged corporate memo. That is a direct, unredacted clinical diagnostic report from the Kensington Institute of Reproductive Medicine, the most prestigious private fertility clinic in the state of Illinois, a clinic your son paid over $80,000 in stolen corporate funds just to access." Joanne's eyes darted to the screen despite her fierce determination to look away. She could not stop herself. The morbid curiosity and the creeping terror forced her to read the glowing text. I watched her pupils dilate as she recognized the official medical seals, the physician's signatures, and the undeniable patient identification block at the top of the page. "Read the patient name, Joanne," I instructed coldly. "Read the date of birth. Read the social security number. That is your perfect, successful son. Now look at the date of the primary diagnosis. It is dated 4 years ago. Exactly 1 month before you brought your first batch of humiliating fertility tea to Sunday dinner. He sat in that clinic, received this exact diagnosis, and then drove to your house and let you publicly degrade me for a biological failing that was entirely his own." She stared at the screen, her breathing stopping completely. I reached out and scrolled down to the detailed laboratory findings, ensuring she saw every highlighted medical term. "The medical term is non-obstructive azoospermia," I read aloud, translating the clinical reality into a weapon. "It means there is an absolute zero sperm count. Zero, Joanne. Not low motility, not a temporary stress-related decline. Absolute zero." The endocrinologist ordered advanced genetic karyotyping to find the root cause. "Look at the highlighted section right there." I pointed to the bold red text on the digital report. "He has an irreversible genetic microdeletion on the Y chromosome." I explained, breaking down the science with ruthless precision. "It is a fundamental chromosomal defect. His body lacks the basic genetic instructions required to produce reproductive cells. No amount of money, no amount of expensive medical intervention, and certainly no amount of your delusional pride can fix a missing piece of his DNA. It is a biological absolute. Cameron has never fathered a child, and he never will." A low, strangled moan escaped Joanna's throat. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, shaking her head side to side. "No, no, no," she whimpered, rocking slightly in the leather chair. The medical jargon had pierced through her denial. She was a woman obsessed with appearances and pedigree, and looking at an official chromosomal defect report was destroying the very foundation of her worldview. "Open your eyes, Joanne," I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip. "We are not finished. You wanted reality, so I am giving you reality." I swiped the screen of my tablet, closing the medical file and opening a secondary dashboard. This one displayed a highly detailed forensic accounting ledger. "Let us connect the dots between your son's broken genetics and your stolen lifestyle," I said. I pulled up the heavily redacted expense reports Jason had hidden on the Nexus servers, placing them side by side with the unredacted invoices from the Kensington Institute. Look at the billing codes. Look at the dates. Cameron and Jason used the exact same dummy corporations to launder money to the fertility clinic that they used to buy your luxury goods. I scrolled down, revealing a side-by-side comparison that was visually devastating. On the left side of the screen was a stolen corporate wire transfer of $12,000 routed to the Kensington Institute for anonymous donor matching services. On the right side of the screen was a stolen corporate wire transfer of $12,000 routed to a luxury boutique in downtown Chicago. Look down at your lap, Joanne. I ordered, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Look at the designer handbag you are clutching like a life preserver. She slowly opened her tear-filled eyes and looked down at the pristine leather bag resting on her knees. The exact same stolen corporate funds that paid for the anonymous sperm donor used to impregnate Ashley also paid for that limited edition bag I revealed. Your entire existence, your social standing, your luxury car, your country club status, and your precious new grandson are all just different line items on the exact same federal fraud indictment. The panic fully set in. The smug, arrogant mask Joanne had worn for decades completely evaporated, leaving behind raw, unadulterated terror. She looked at the designer bag in her lap, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. She suddenly released her grip on the leather handles, pushing the bag away from her body, so violently it tumbled off her lap and crashed onto the hospital floor. The contents spilled out across the polished marble, but she did not even glance at them. She looked at the blue mylar balloons still tied around her wrist. The glittery, "It is a boy." Letters seemed to mock her now. She clawed frantically at the plastic ribbons, tearing them away from her wrist. The balloons floated up to the ceiling, scraping against the acoustic tiles and hovering there out of reach. She wanted to scrub her hands clean. She wanted to undo the last 10 minutes of her life. "It is all stolen!" she gasped, her voice breaking into a ragged sob. "The money, the baby, it is all fake." "It is all fake," I confirmed, staring down at her broken form with absolute indifference. "Your son is a thief. Your grandson is a biological stranger conceived with stolen money and anonymous genetics because your son is less of a man than he ever pretended to be." Ashley stayed with him because he funded her luxury lifestyle with wire fraud. She played the perfect loving wife while happily spending stolen venture capital funds to buy her dream life. And you, Joanne, you paraded around Chicago looking down your nose at everyone while wearing clothes and driving cars that rightfully belong to the federal government. Joanne slumped forward, burying her face in her hands. The deep, racking sobs that tore through her body were not born of remorse or guilt for how she had treated me. They were the agonizing cries of a woman realizing her entire identity was about to be publicly stripped away. She realized she was holding stolen goods. She realized she was an accessory to a crime that was going to put her son in federal prison. She realized the country club would revoke her membership, the socialites would shun her, and the bank would foreclose on everything she thought she owned. And the most devastating blow of all, the biological legacy she had just spent the last 20 minutes aggressively shoving in my face, was a physical impossibility. The child upstairs shared absolutely zero connection to her family tree. Her bloodline ended with Cameron. She wept openly, the sound of her humiliation filling the sterile lounge. But the nightmare was only just beginning. Because while she was drowning in the realization of the medical and financial fraud, the final piece of the trap was moving right into place. The hallway outside the VIP lounge remained quiet, but the electronic display above the main elevator bank suddenly illuminated. The numbers began to descend, counting down to the ground floor, and then rapidly ascending back up toward the maternity ward. The final blow was riding that elevator, and she had no idea the destruction was about to become physical. I turned the tablet screen back toward her, forcing her tear-filled eyes to focus on a completely new document. The medical files vanished into the digital background, replaced by the stark, imposing seal of the United States Department of Justice. The header read clearly across the glowing high-resolution display, "Drafted Federal Indictment." I watched Joanne blink rapidly through her tears, her brain struggling to shift gears from biological devastation to legal annihilation. She was already drowning in the reality of her son's sterility, but I needed her fully submerged in the consequences of his greed. Read the title, Joanne. I commanded, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a judge passing down a final sentence. Read the exact charges the federal government is leveling against your perfect provider. She squinted, her hands trembling so violently she had to grip the padded armrests of the leather chair just to keep from falling onto the polished marble floor. Wire fraud, she whispered, her voice cracking on the syllables as if the words themselves were physically painful to speak. Money laundering, corporate embezzlement, 57 counts. I confirmed, stepping back so she could absorb the sheer magnitude of the legal document presented before her. Each individual count carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Do the math, Joanne. Your son is facing multiple lifetimes behind bars. This is not a civil dispute over a severance package or a minor accounting error that can be swept under the rug. This is a federal criminal case built on undeniable forensic evidence, the kind of evidence that prosecutors build entire careers upon, the kind of evidence that guarantees a conviction before the trial even begins. She let out a small, wounded noise, shaking her head side to side in a frantic rhythm of denial. He can hire a defense attorney, she choked out, clinging to the last shreds of her elite worldview. We can fight this. We know people in this city. We have connections. We will not just roll over and let you do this to him. You have absolutely nothing, I corrected sharply, my tone slicing through her desperate delusion. Your connections are built on stolen money and your assets are about to be frozen completely. You cannot hire a high-powered white-collar defense attorney when your bank accounts are seized by the federal government under racketeering laws. Every single dollar Cameron stole is currently being traced, mapped, and locked down by federal authorities. He will not be able to afford a public defender, let alone a top-tier legal team to save him from this disaster. Joanne looked up at me, her eyes filled with a horrific, dawning realization. Her makeup was entirely ruined, dark tracks of mascara staining her pale cheeks. Why, she gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. Why wait this long? If you knew he was stealing 6 months ago, why let it continue? Why let him buy the car and the country club membership in this hospital suite? Why let us believe we were safe? I smiled, a cold, calculated expression that made her shrink further back into the chair. Because taking him down 6 months ago would have just gotten him fired, I explained, my tone devoid of any mercy or hesitation. If I had simply handed the initial audit report to the board of directors when I first found the discrepancies, they would have quietly dismissed him to avoid a massive public scandal. He would have walked away with a slap on the wrist, maybe a quiet non-disclosure settlement, and he would have moved on to scam another company. He would have survived the fallout. I did not want him to survive Joanne. I wanted him eradicated from the corporate world forever. I paced slowly across the room, detailing the exact methodology of my revenge, ensuring she understood the terrifying depth of my patience. I needed him to feel invincible. I continued, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. I needed him to become so comfortable with his theft that he stopped covering his tracks altogether. When a thief thinks nobody is watching, he gets sloppy. I gave him enough rope to hang himself, and I watched him eagerly tie the noose. I monitored his accounts every single day. I watched him authorize larger and larger wire transfers directly from my office. I watched him funnel money into those offshore dummy corporations with absolute reckless abandon while he thought he was a mastermind. I stopped pacing and stood directly over her again, ensuring she understood the absolute finality of his doom. I waited 6 months because I needed to isolate his guilt entirely. Jason, the co-founder, is going down for his own distinct crimes, but I made absolutely certain that Cameron's embezzlement was completely unassailable and solely in his name. There is zero plausible deniability here. He cannot claim he was acting on orders from the board of directors. He cannot claim it was a simple accounting error or a misunderstanding of corporate policy. I documented every digital signature, every IP address match, and every single email where he actively instructed the finance department to bypass standard compliance checks. I built a titanium cage around him, and he happily locked the door from the inside. Joanne pressed both hands against her chest as if trying to keep her heart from exploding out of her ribcage. The layers of her manufactured reality were peeling away, exposing the absolute wasteland of her future. The arrogance she had worn like a crown for decades was completely obliterated, replaced by a suffocating blanket of dread. She was a woman who valued appearances above all else, and she was currently staring at the total destruction of her social standing. "You are going to take everything," she whimpered, her voice barely a breath echoing in the quiet lounge. "I am not taking anything, Joanne," I corrected smoothly, folding my arms across my chest. "The federal government is taking it. They are going to seize the luxury condo Cameron bought for Ashley because it was purchased with illicit funds. They are going to impound that gleaming silver Mercedes parked downstairs in the VIP lot. They are going to freeze the bank accounts you use to pay your country club dues and your expensive salon appointments. Every piece of jewelry, every expensive dinner, every ounce of status you acquired over the last 2 years is going to be confiscated as proceeds of a federal crime." I leaned down, bracing my hands on the padded arms of her chair, bringing my face level with hers. "You came here today to gloat about a legacy," I whispered, my words hitting her like physical blows. "You wanted to rub my nose in your son's success and his brand new family. But the legacy Cameron actually built is a massive criminal record. His grand success is a federal indictment that will put him away for decades. And his new family is about to become entirely destitute." I let the reality of Ashley's situation sink into her mind. Ashley is going to be left as a single mother to a child that does not even share your bloodline, and she will not have a single dime of stolen money to support her. Do you honestly think a woman who married a man specifically for his wealth is going to stick around when the federal agents show up to seize her designer wardrobe? She is going to abandon him the second the money dries up, and you will be left with absolutely nothing. Joanne's entire body shuddered uncontrollably. The devastating truth of my words settled over her, crushing her spirit entirely. She realized with terrifying clarity that she was not just losing her wealth, she was losing her identity. The high society friends she desperately tried to impress would abandon her the moment the scandal broke on the evening news. The country club board would revoke her membership to avoid the association. The local gossips would tear her apart over their afternoon teas. She would be known not as the wealthy matriarch of a highly successful family, but as the mother of a convicted felon who funded her arrogant lifestyle with stolen corporate cash. She let out a loud, agonizing wail, bending forward until her forehead rested against her knees. She wrapped her arms tightly around her head, trying to block out the reality I had just forced her to confront. It was the sound of total defeat, the sound of a woman realizing her life was effectively over. Her perfect son was a criminal, her grandson was a biological stranger, and her wealth was an illusion that was rapidly evaporating into thin air. I stood up, straightening my blazer and looking down at her broken form. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the profound, pristine satisfaction of a job perfectly executed. I had spent 3 years carrying the weight of the humiliation they had inflicted upon me. I had swallowed their insults, endured their gaslighting, and walked away in silence when they stole my life. Today I was finally handing all of that pain back to them with compounded interest. The electronic chime of the elevator bank echoed through the silent waiting lounge, signaling the arrival of the final act. I turned my attention toward the polished steel doors, watching the digital display light up as the car reached our floor. The mechanism whirred softly, a stark contrast to the heavy dramatic tension filling the room. "Wipe your tears, Joanne," I commanded, my voice ringing with cold, unyielding authority. "Crying will not save you now. The countdown is officially over." Joanne began to hyperventilate. The harsh, ragged sounds of her breathing filled the sterile waiting room, echoing off the polished glass walls like the desperate gasps of a drowning woman. Her chest heaved violently beneath her luxurious cashmere coat, and her eyes darted around the room in a state of absolute feral panic. The perfectly manicured image of the wealthy Chicago matriarch was completely eradicated, leaving nothing behind but a terrified, fragile shell. Her hands shook with such violent tremors that she could barely keep herself upright in the leather waiting chair. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire universe burn to the ground and was now frantically trying to gather the remaining ashes. Unable to process the financial and legal devastation I had just laid out before her, Joanne retreated to the only emotional anchor she thought she still possessed. She lunged forward, her trembling fingers desperately grabbing at the trailing plastic ribbon of one of the blue mylar balloons that had drifted down toward the floor. She clutched the shiny blue string against her chest, wrapping it around her fist as if it were a physical tether keeping her tied to reality. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking display of pure denial. "He is still my grandson!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her hysteria. She pulled the balloon string tighter, pressing her hands against her heart. "I do not care about the venture capitalists. I do not care about the audits or the offshore accounts or whatever federal nonsense you are talking about. He is up there right now. He gave me a family. He gave us a future. Cameron is a father, and no amount of your toxic, vindictive auditing can take that baby away from me. Ashley is my daughter-in-law, and that beautiful little boy is my blood." I stood perfectly still, watching her unravel with a profound, clinical detachment. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was almost awe-inspiring. She was standing in the middle of a burning building, and instead of running for the exit, she was trying to convince herself that the flames were just keeping her warm. I slowly shook my head, allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I took a deliberate step closer, my shadow falling over her trembling form. "Joanne," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm register that forced her to stop shouting and listen. "You are not hearing me. Your brain is refusing to process the medical reality because your ego simply cannot handle the sheer scale of the humiliation. I need you to listen to the words I am saying, and I need you to understand their absolute biological finality." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, tightening the invisible noose around her neck. "Cameron is sterile, Joanne. He is completely, fundamentally, and irreversibly sterile. That child resting in the luxury maternity suite upstairs shares absolutely zero DNA with your family. He does not have Cameron's eyes. He does not have your father's strong jawline. He does not possess a single microscopic drop of your precious aristocratic blood. That baby is a complete biological stranger to you. Your grand genetic legacy is a total fabrication built on stolen corporate funds and medical deceit." She squeezed her eyes shut violently, shaking her head from side to side as if the physical motion could physically reject my words. "No," she whimpered, the sound tearing from her throat in a ragged, agonizing sob. "You are lying. You are just trying to hurt me because you are barren. You are projecting your own failures onto my son. Ashley got pregnant. The doctors confirmed it. The baby is real." "The baby is very real," I agreed smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "But your connection to him is entirely imaginary. You spent the last 20 minutes bragging about how Ashley gave Cameron the one thing I never could. You gloated about how she stepped up and provided a biological heir. But Ashley did not give Cameron a son, Joanne. Ashley gave Cameron a prop. She gave him a highly expensive accessory to complete his fake image of the perfect corporate family man." I leaned down, bracing my hands on the arms of her chair, trapping her in place, so she had nowhere to look but directly into my eyes. "Do you remember how much you used to brag about your family tree?" I asked softly, twisting the knife deeper into her shattered pride. "Do you remember those extravagant holiday parties where you would proudly point out the distinct physical traits that ran in your bloodline? You were so obsessed with pedigree. You treated genetics like a status symbol, something to be flaunted and worshipped. And you used my inability to conceive as proof that I was somehow biologically inferior to your pristine lineage." Joanne's breathing was incredibly fast and shallow now. She was trapped in the chair, clutching the balloon ribbon, her eyes wide with a horrific dawning comprehension. "But your bloodline ends with Cameron." I stated the words, striking her like physical blows. "It ends right here in this hospital. There is no legacy. There is no future generation carrying your name. When the federal agents freeze your assets and seize your home, You will not even have the comfort of a true family to fall back on. You will be left completely alone defending a son who is going to federal prison for wire fraud and a daughter-in-law who used him to finance her pregnancy. She let out a loud, agonizing wail, bending forward until her forehead nearly rested on her knees. She wrapped her arms tightly around her head, trying to block out the devastating truth. But her mind was finally starting to connect the horrifying dots. The unredacted medical reports I had shown her, the heavy clinical terminology, the absolute zero sperm count. It was all crashing down on her at once. They used a donor, she gasped, suddenly, sitting up, her face streaked with ruined mascara and tears. Her eyes darted wildly as she desperately tried to construct a new narrative to save her pride. That is what happened. The clinic invoices you showed me. They used an anonymous donor. They picked someone with strong genetics. It does not matter if they used a clinic, Chelsea. Cameron is still the father on the birth certificate. He is still the man who is going to raise that boy. He stepped up and took responsibility. That makes him the real father. You cannot take that away from us. I let out a harsh, slicing laugh that echoed off the glass walls of the VIP lounge. The fact that she was now trying to proudly claim an anonymous sperm donor as a victory just to spite me was truly the pinnacle of her desperation. She was willing to accept any reality as long as it meant she did not have to admit total defeat. "Oh, Joanne, you truly are pathetic," I whispered, standing up to my full height and looking down at her with absolute disgust. "You are so desperate to maintain your illusion of a perfect family that you are willing to embrace a child bought out of a medical catalog with stolen venture capital funds. You are willing to smile and play grandmother to a test tube baby just so you do not have to admit that your son is a fraud." I turned and paced a few steps away, letting the tension in the room build to an unbearable peak before spinning back to face her. "But here's the most beautiful, devastating part of this entire tragedy," I said, my voice ringing with cold, unyielding authority. "You think they used an anonymous donor from that expensive private clinic? You think Cameron sat down with Ashley and carefully selected a medical profile to ensure the baby would be perfect and healthy? You think this was a joint decision made by a loving couple trying to overcome a difficult medical obstacle?" Joanne stared at me, her jaw trembling uncontrollably. She could sense that the final blow was coming, and she was entirely powerless to stop it. "I audited the clinic invoices, Joanne." I continued, methodically destroying her last remaining shred of hope. "I tracked every single dollar Cameron wired to the Kensington Institute. The money did not go toward anonymous donor selection services. The money went toward standard prenatal care premium ultrasound packages and the reservation of that luxury maternity suite upstairs." Her brow furrowed in deep, desperate confusion. She clutched the blue balloon string so tightly the plastic snapped, leaving her holding a useless piece of ribbon. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice barely a breath. "The medical report said he was sterile. If they did not use an anonymous donor from the clinic, then how did Ashley get pregnant?" I watched her mind frantically try to solve the impossible equation. I watched the wheels turning in her head as she mentally reviewed the timeline, the stolen money, and the biological absolute of her son's condition. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, and I was about to give her the final push. I checked my watch, the diamond face catching the overhead lights. The sleek silver second hand clicked into place, perfectly aligned with the 12. "If Cameron is sterile, whose baby is it?" Joanne asked, her voice shattering into a hysterical, high-pitched squeak. I looked up from my watch and met her terrified eyes, offering her a smile of pure, pristine destruction. 0 minutes left. "Joanne," I announced, my voice echoing clearly through the quiet hospital lounge. "Why do you not ask the real father? He is getting off the elevator right now." The polished steel doors of the main elevator bank slid open with a soft, melodic chime that sounded exactly like a death knell in the quiet lounge. I watched Joanna Tear's streaked face turn toward the sound, her breath catching sharply in her throat, as the final act of my orchestration stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light. Jason, the arrogant co-founder of Nexus Logistics, burst through the sliding doors before they had even fully parted. He moved with a frantic, unhinged energy that completely contradicted his usual carefully curated Silicon Valley persona. His expensive tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie hung loose and crooked around his neck, and his eyes were wild with a desperate possessive frenzy. He looked exactly like a man who knew his entire world was collapsing and was rushing to grab the only thing he actually cared about before the flames consumed him utterly. But Jason was not alone. The heavy, deliberate footsteps that followed him out of the elevator belonged to a vastly different breed of men. Right behind his frantic strides came two federal agents dressed in immaculate dark suits. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying calm, their expressions carved from solid stone, their hands resting naturally near their waistbands. They projected the absolute, unyielding authority of the United States government arriving to collect its long overdue debts. And stepping out flawlessly between the two agents was Alexander Sterling. Alexander moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned everything he looked at. His presence alone commanded the air in the room, dropping the temperature by several degrees. He locked eyes with me across the VIP lounge and offered a brief respectful nod, acknowledging that the trap we had spent half a year building was now perfectly sealed. He was not just the billionaire head of Vanguard Venture Capital who had funded this acquisition. He was the man who had stood beside me, supported my vision, and asked me to marry him just 2 months ago. We had built an empire together, and today we were executing a flawless demolition. Jason did not even register my presence in the room. He did not notice Alexander or the federal agents taking up strategic positions by the stairwell exits. His eyes rapidly scanned the hanging signs pointing toward the private maternity suites, his chest heaving as he oriented himself. He started marching down the corridor, a man on a singular, desperate mission. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly against the glass walls, disrupting the pristine silence of the VIP wing. "Where is Ashley? Where is my son?" The words struck Joanne like a physical blow to the chest. She scrambled up from the leather waiting chair, her ruined designer coat slipping off one shoulder. Her brain, desperately clinging to the last shreds of her fabricated reality, recognized Jason as Cameron's business partner. In her twisted, frantic logic, she assumed Jason was here to warn Cameron about the audit or offer some kind of legal support. She threw herself into Jason's path, physically blocking his way to the heavy double doors of the maternity ward. "Jason," she cried out, her voice shrill and wet with tears. "Jason, you have to help us. Chelsea is lying. She is making up horrible things about the company and about Cameron. She is trying to say the baby is not his. You have to tell her she is crazy." Jason stopped short, glaring down at the frantic older woman blocking his path. His expression twisted into a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Joanne not as the respected mother of his co-founder, but as an annoying, irrelevant obstacle standing between him and his child. He swatted her hands away from his arm with a brutal, dismissive motion. "Get out of my way, Joanne," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "I do not have time for your pathetic family drama. The feds are literally breathing down my neck, and they are about to freeze every single asset I own. I am going in there to get Ashley, and I am taking my boy before your idiot son tries to put his name on the birth certificate." Joanna's mouth fell open, her jaw trembling violently. She staggered backward as if he had struck her across the face. What she gasped, her hands flying up to clutch at her throat. "What are you saying? That is Cameron's son. That is my grandson. You are his business partner. You are supposed to be his friend. Why are you saying these horrible things?" Jason let out a harsh, manic laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Friend," he mocked, stepping closer and forcing Joanne to shrink back against the corridor wall. "You think Cameron has friends? You think anyone in the tech industry actually respects that mediocre, empty suit? I tolerated your son Joanne because he was a convenient, easily manipulated shield. He was the perfect corporate mascot. And while he was busy playing the big, important executive, playing golf and stealing venture capital money to buy you luxury cars, Ashley and I were living the actual reality." He leaned down, his face mere inches from Joanne's, terrified eyes delivering the truth with ruthless precision. "Ashley and I have been sleeping together for 2 solid years, Joanne, right under his stupid, oblivious nose. We started hooking up before they even bought that ridiculous suburban house. She never loved him. She never even liked him. She looked at Cameron and saw a massive, bottomless wallet. She saw a man so desperate to project a perfect image that he would happily pay for everything she ever wanted without asking a single difficult question. She laughed at him, Joanne. We both laughed at his desperate need to feel important. No, Joanne wailed, covering her ears with her hands, shaking her head frantically from side to side. Stop it. I will not listen to this. You are all lying to me. Ashley loves him. She went through the fertility treatments with him. She gave him a family. She is my daughter-in-law. The fertility treatments? Jason sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. Are you really that blind? Ashley knew Cameron was shooting blanks the entire time. They went to the Kensington Institute together, but she was coming to my apartment every single night. We used his stolen corporate money to pay for her premium healthcare in the luxury hospital suite, but that biology is entirely mine. We used him, Joanne. We used your perfect, successful son as a human piggy bank because his ego was so incredibly fragile. He preferred to buy a fake family rather than admit he was biologically useless. I watched the devastating truth wash over Joanne, stripping away the final layers of her manufactured dignity. She tried to formulate a sentence, tried to muster one last defense of her golden child, but her voice completely failed her. The sheer volume of the betrayal was too massive for her fragile ego to process. Jason stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a selfish, intense need to claim his biological property. He did not care that he was destroying an older woman. He only cared that his time as a free man was rapidly evaporating, and he needed to see his son before the steel cuffs locked around his wrists. You thought you were so superior, Joanne Jason continued, his tone laced with a brutal, mocking edge. You thought your family was untouchable because Cameron threw some stolen cash around the country club. You paraded Ashley around like a trophy wife, oblivious to the fact that she was actively helping me draft the fake vendor invoices that funded your entire lifestyle. She forwarded me every single password Cameron foolishly wrote down. We drained the venture capital accounts together, and we planned to leave him holding the empty bag the second the federal auditors caught the scent. We just did not expect the lead auditor to be the woman he threw away. Joanna's hands dropped to the polished marble floor, her perfectly manicured nails scraping uselessly against the stone. The depth of the conspiracy was staggering. Ashley had not just betrayed Cameron romantically, she had been an active, willing participant in his financial ruin. The woman Joanne had championed, the woman she had used to replace me, had orchestrated the absolute downfall of her precious son. Every cruel comparison Joanne had ever made between me and Ashley echoed back to haunt her. She had actively cheered for the architect of her own destruction. Joanne collapsed against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, and the reality of her total destruction finally took hold. Every single boast she had made, every cruel word she had thrown at me about her genetic legacy and her son's superiority was now ashes in her mouth. She had built her entire identity on a lie funded by fraud and executed by the woman she thought was her perfect daughter-in-law. The hospital staff at the nearby reception desk watched the entire scene unfold in stunned silence. But nobody moved to help her. Her humiliation was absolute and public. Jason did not spare her another glance. He turned away from her sobbing form and faced the heavy wooden doors leading to the private maternity suites. He reached out to push them open completely, consumed by his need to claim the child he had fathered in secret. He was entirely focused on retrieving Ashley and the baby before the federal agents could place him in handcuffs. He believed he still had a few seconds left to salvage some part of his life. But before his hands could touch the polished wood, the doors swung open from the inside. The timing was so incredibly perfect, it felt scripted by a master director. Cameron stepped out into the hallway, holding a cup of expensive hospital coffee and wearing an expression of exhausted pride. He was dressed in a soft cashmere sweater, looking every bit the wealthy, successful new father he believed himself to be. He was completely oblivious to the massacre that had just taken place on the other side of those doors. Cameron looked up, his proud smile freezing instantly as he took in the chaotic scene before him. He saw his mother weeping uncontrollably on the floor, her designer coat bunched awkwardly around her waist. He saw his business partner looking frantic and disheveled, blocking the doorway. He saw me standing calmly by the window, projecting absolute, untouchable authority. And finally, his eyes landed on the two federal agents, and Alexander Sterling standing silently in the background, their presence radiating undeniable doom. The cup of coffee slipped from Cameron's hand, crashing onto the marble floor and splattering dark liquid across his expensive leather shoes. The grand illusion of his perfect life shattered right alongside it. The heavy ceramic coffee cup shattered against the polished marble, sending a dark, sprawling wave of hot liquid over the toe of Cameron's custom Italian leather loafers. He did not even flinch. He stood perfectly paralyzed in the threshold of the heavy wooden doors, his hand still hovering in the exact position it had been when he dropped the cup. Just moments prior, he had been the portrait of the triumphant modern patriarch. His cashmere sweater sleeves were pushed up to his forearms to project a rugged paternal exhaustion, and his hair was perfectly tousled. He had stepped into this hallway, expecting to receive a standing ovation from his adoring mother, expecting to bask in the validation of his manufactured success. Instead, he found a firing squad waiting for him. His eyes darted frantically across the surreal tableau, attempting to force the impossible pieces into a coherent narrative. He looked at Jason expecting camaraderie, but found only lethal contempt. He looked at the two men in dark suits, registering the severe, unyielding posture of federal law enforcement. He looked at his mother sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, surrounded by discarded balloons and a spilled designer handbag. And then, finally, his gaze locked onto me. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The arrogant swagger he had carried for years evaporated into thin air. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation or assert his usual dominance, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was a man standing on a trap door that had just been unbolted. Before Cameron could formulate a single word, Alexander stepped forward. The sheer gravitational pull of Alexander's presence instantly commanded the entire corridor. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True power never has to shout to be heard. Cameron Alexander said, his tone smooth and perfectly chilled. "We have not formally met, though I have spent quite a bit of time reviewing your work recently. I am Alexander Sterling, managing partner at Vanguard Venture Capital. As of 9 o'clock this morning, my firm executed a full buyout and assumed absolute controlling interest of Nexus Logistics." Cameron's jaw trembled. He looked from Alexander to Jason, seeking some kind of confirmation or lifeline, but Jason just glared back with absolute disgust. He could not comprehend how a billionaire investor was standing in a hospital hallway addressing him directly. The cognitive dissonance was entirely paralyzing. "An acquisition," Cameron managed to croak out, his voice sounding small and remarkably weak. "Jason, what is he talking about? Why are you here? Why is she here?" Alexander did not let Jason answer. He maintained absolute control of the execution, ensuring the boundaries of power were clearly drawn. "She is here because she is the lead forensic auditor I contracted to evaluate your company before we finalize the acquisition," Alexander explained, gesturing cleanly toward me. "Chelsea uncovered a highly sophisticated, but ultimately deeply flawed network of financial discrepancies hidden within your operations department. She mapped out the offshore accounts. She tracked the dummy corporations, and she documented the exact flow of venture capital funds you illegally diverted to finance your personal lifestyle." Cameron took a reflexive step backward, his shoulders hitting the heavy wooden doors behind him with a dull thud. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The realization that the woman he had discarded and humiliated was the exact architect of his corporate destruction was actively short-circuiting his brain. He had built his entire identity on the belief that I was inferior and broken. Now he was staring at the undeniable proof that I held his entire world in the palm of my hand. He shook his head, holding up his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. "There is a mistake," he stammered, his voice pitching higher with pure panic. Chelsea, you know this is a mistake. I am a vice president. I have stock options. I have authorized spending limits. Jason, tell them. Tell them I had board approval for the expansion budgets. You have to tell them this is just an accounting error. We can fix the ledgers. We can reorganize the expense reports. You do not have a title anymore, Cameron Alexander stated, cutting off the pathetic display with surgical precision. As the new majority shareholder, my first executive action was to terminate your employment effectively immediately. You have been stripped of your title, stripped of your stock options, and permanently banned from the premises of Nexus Logistics. The security credentials you used to access the building have been revoked and your corporate email server has been locked down. You are no longer an executive. You are simply an unemployed liability. Alexander took a slow, deliberate step back, yielding the floor with practiced precision. And since Vanguard Venture Capital operates with a strict zero-tolerance policy for corporate embezzlement, I have surrendered all of Chelsea's forensic findings directly to the United States Department of Justice. I believe these gentlemen have some business to conclude with you. The two federal agents moved forward simultaneously, executing their duty with mechanical, flawless efficiency. The taller agent reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded document, holding it up so Cameron could see the official seals stamped heavily across the front page. Cameron Davis, the agent, announced, his voice ringing down the hospital corridor with undeniable finality. I am Special Agent Miller with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on 57 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. Cameron shrank against the doors, shaking his head frantically, as if denying the reality would magically make the agents disappear. No, he gasped, trying to press himself into the very wood to escape the impending doom. You cannot do this here. My wife is right inside. My newborn son is in there. I am a father. You cannot arrest me in front of my family. I have money. I can pay it back. I can write a check right now to clear up this entire misunderstanding. Just let me talk to my lawyers and we will settle this quietly. You do not have any money, Cameron, I spoke up, my voice slicing cleanly through his pathetic begging. I stepped forward, making sure I was the very last thing he focused on before the reality of his prison sentence set in. Every single bank account tied to your name was frozen by federal order at 8 o'clock this morning. Your offshore accounts in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands have been seized. The luxury condo you bought for Ashley is currently being padlocked by federal marshals. You cannot write a check because you do not own a single thing in this world that was not bought with stolen cash. You are entirely, completely bankrupt. The second federal agent reached to his belt, unholstering a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic grinding sound of the chain cutting through the air silenced any further protests Cameron might have conjured. Turn around and place your hands behind your back, sir. The agent commanded, his grip firmly, establishing control over Cameron's shoulder. Cameron looked absolutely broken. The golden child, the perfect provider, the arrogant executive had been completely eradicated. He was nothing but a terrified, exposed fraud, standing in a puddle of expensive coffee. He slowly turned around, his posture slumping entirely as he placed his trembling hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet corridor, sounding like the definitive end of his entire existence. As the agent secured his arms, Jason finally moved. He did not look at Cameron with any lingering sympathy or shared history. He did not care about the company they had built together or the friendship they had previously faked. He stepped right past the handcuffed man, brushing his shoulder roughly against Cameron's cashmere sweater. Jason, where are you going? Cameron pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. Jason, you have to help me. You have to call the corporate lawyers. Tell them about the baby. Tell them I have a son who needs his father. Jason paused, his hand resting firmly on the brass handle of the maternity ward doors. He turned his head and looked at Cameron over his shoulder with a sneer of absolute, devastating pity. I am going in there to see my son, Cameron. Jason said, his words hitting the quiet hallway like a detonation. Ashley and I have been sleeping together for 2 solid years. You were just the bankroll. You were just the useful idiot we kept around to pay the luxury bills. And now that your accounts are frozen, you are completely useless to both of us. Enjoy federal prison, you pathetic, sterile idiot. Jason pushed the heavy wooden doors open and disappeared into the maternity suite, leaving the absolute wreckage of Cameron's life out in the hallway for everyone to witness. Cameron stood frozen, the heavy steel cuffs binding his wrists tightly behind his back. Jason's words had just triggered a total psychological collapse. The medical truth, the betrayal of his wife, the utter destruction of his biological legacy, it all crashed down upon him in a single agonizing wave. He looked frantically toward the VIP lounge, his eyes desperately searching for the one person who had always bailed him out, who had always protected his fragile ego. "Mom," he cried out, his voice breaking into a ragged, helpless sob. "Mom, please, tell them it is a lie. Tell them Ashley loves me. Tell them about the baby. Mom, you have to fix this. You have to call someone to fix this." But Joanne could not fix anything. She was slumped sideways in the leather waiting chair, a broken, weeping mess. Her expensive cashmere coat was wrinkled and stained with tears, her pristine blowout completely destroyed. She could not even bring herself to look her son in the eye. The shame was too immense, the humiliation too absolute. She had built her entire identity around his grand success and his biological legacy, and she was currently sitting in the ashes of both. She simply stared at the floor, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs, unable to offer him a single word of comfort or denial. She knew the truth, and the truth had broken her. The entire corridor was filled with hospital staff and lingering visitors who had stopped dead in their tracks to watch the spectacle unfold. Nurses holding charts, orderlies pushing empty wheelchairs, and receptionists peering over their elevated desks all bore witness to the total annihilation of the perfect family. The wealthy, arrogant matriarch was crying pathetically on the floor while her supposedly brilliant son stood handcuffed, stripped of his wife, his child, his career, and his freedom in a matter of minutes. The federal agents took Cameron's arms, guiding him forcefully away from the maternity ward doors. His head hung low, his chin resting heavily against his chest as he was marched down the hallway. He did not struggle. He did not protest anymore. The fight had been completely drained from him, leaving only a hollow, terrifying emptiness where his bloated ego used to reside. He dragged his feet across the polished marble, a broken man heading toward a cage he had built himself. I stood perfectly still, watching them march him toward the elevator bank. I felt a profound, pristine sense of closure settling over my chest. The agonizing years of gaslighting, the deep cuts of his betrayal, the absolute nightmare of my silent exit 3 years ago, had all led exactly to this magnificent moment. The scales of justice had finally balanced, and I was the one holding the weights. The weeks that followed the hospital confrontation moved with the relentless, terrifying speed of a synchronized avalanche. Once the federal government sank its teeth into the financial wreckage of Nexus Logistics, there was absolutely no room for negotiation. Cameron did not even attempt to take the case to trial. Faced with the mountain of unassailable forensic evidence my firm had meticulously prepared, his defense attorney advised him to take a blind plea deal, hoping for a shred of leniency. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse on a crisp Tuesday morning, watching the man who had once systematically destroyed my self-worth stand before a federal judge. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound by heavy chains that rattled loudly in the cavernous, silent room. The judge did not mince words. He looked down from the bench and called Cameron's actions a textbook display of corporate greed, sociopathic entitlement, and profound moral bankruptcy. Cameron was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He was also ordered to pay millions in federal restitution, ensuring his wages would be garnished for the rest of his natural life. As the bailiffs led him out of the courtroom, he did not look back. There was no defiant smirk, no arrogant swagger, and no illusion of superiority. He was a hollowed-out shell of a man entirely erased from the corporate world he once believed he ruled. Jason met a similarly devastating fate, though his cowardice took a different form. While he managed to avoid direct prison time by aggressively cooperating with the federal prosecutors and turning over decades of corporate secrets, his financial ruin was absolute. Vanguard Venture Capital seized every single asset tied to the Nexus Logistics founders. His luxury penthouses, his diversified stock portfolios, and his exotic car collection were all aggressively liquidated to compensate the defrauded investors. Within 2 months, Jason was completely bankrupt and permanently blacklisted from Silicon Valley. Unsurprisingly, a man entirely motivated by greed and ego possessed zero capacity for actual fatherhood or loyalty. The moment the federal agents froze his bank accounts and the glamorous lifestyle evaporated, Jason vanished. He abandoned Ashley in Chicago, fleeing to another state to avoid child support filings he could no longer afford to fight. Ashley, the woman who had sat on my sofa and plotted to steal my home, was left completely alone. The luxury condo Cameron had purchased for her was immediately seized by the government, leaving her scrambling to find a cramped apartment in a neighborhood she previously would have scoffed at. She became a single mother, raising a child entirely on her own, without the stolen wealth she had traded her integrity to secure. She traded a loyal best friend for a mountain of fraudulent promises, and she was left holding absolutely nothing but the bitter consequences. But perhaps the most poetic destruction belonged to Joanne. Without Cameron's stolen corporate funds constantly flowing into her accounts, her entire manufactured reality imploded in a matter of weeks. The bank moved swiftly to foreclose on her sprawling suburban estate. The silver Mercedes-Benz was repossessed right out of her driveway in broad daylight, while her neighbors watched from their pristine front lawns. The Oak Brook Country Club quietly but firmly revoked her membership, citing the morality clause in their bylaws, to surgically distance themselves from the highly publicized federal fraud scandal. The society friends she had spent years desperately trying to impress immediately shunned her. Her phone stopped ringing. Her invitations ceased. When she tried to attend a charity luncheon, she was politely asked to leave by the venue management. She was effectively exiled from the only world she cared about. She was forced to move into a tiny rented apartment, entirely stripped of the prestige she had weaponized against me for so many years. She had built her entire identity on a pedestal of stolen cash, and when the cash vanished, she ceased to exist in the eyes of Chicago high society. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of delusion. 5 months after Cameron's sentencing, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a quarterly restructuring report when my intercom buzzed. It was my executive assistant, a razor-sharp professional who guarded my time with absolute ruthlessness. She informed me that a frantic woman claiming to be my former mother-in-law was online too, demanding to speak with me. Joanne had finally exhausted her options and resorted to begging the very woman she had tormented. I authorized my assistant to handle the call while I listened quietly on the muted line. Joanne's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding aged, broken, and entirely stripped of her former aristocratic arrogance. She pleaded with my assistant, sobbing heavily about how family should always forgive one another during difficult times. She begged for me to use my influence with Vanguard Venture Capital to release a small fraction of the frozen funds, just enough for her to pay her mounting legal bills and secure a better apartment. She claimed she was severely unwell and that the stress of the scandal was actively destroying her health. She actually used the word family, as if those syllables could magically erase the years of psychological torture she had gleefully subjected me to. My assistant did not miss a single beat. Her tone remained perfectly polite, exceptionally professional, and entirely devoid of mercy. She calmly informed Joanne that our firm did not conduct business with family members of convicted felons, and strongly advised her to direct any further financial inquiries to the Federal Restitution Office. Before Joanne could launch into another desperate, hysterical plea, my assistant cleanly disconnected the line. The sharp click of the receiver was the final definitive period at the end of a very long, turbulent chapter. Later that evening, I stood on the sprawling wrap-around balcony of my downtown penthouse. The Chicago skyline stretched out before me, a glittering ocean of glass and steel illuminating the dark night sky. The bitter winter wind had softened into a gentle, cool breeze that carried the distant hum of the city. I held a crystal glass of expensive champagne, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips. The quiet luxury of my surroundings was not bought with stolen funds or fraudulent promises. It was the undeniable physical manifestation of my own intellect, my resilience, and my absolute refusal to be broken by mediocre people. Alexander stepped out onto the balcony behind me. The heavy glass door slid shut, muting the ambient noise of the penthouse interior. I felt the warm, comforting weight of his hands settling gently on my shoulders. He pressed a soft kiss to the side of my head, wrapping his arms around me to shield me from the evening chill. We stood together in comfortable silence, looking out over the city we were actively conquering. He did not ask what I was thinking. He already knew. We were partners in every sense of the word, equals, who challenged, respected, and elevated one another. There was no toxic competition, no fragile ego demanding to be coddled, and absolutely no deceit in our foundation. I leaned back against his solid chest, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp city air. I reflected on the agonizing journey that had brought me to this exact altitude. 3 years ago, I was a shattered, gaslit wife, walking out of a stolen house with a single suitcase, believing my life was entirely over. I had let manipulative, toxic people convince me that I was defective, that my professional ambition was a fatal flaw, and that my inherent worth was tied to my ability to endure their systematic abuse. I had allowed myself to be rendered small so their fragile egos could feel large. But as I watched the city lights reflecting in my champagne glass, a profound, pristine clarity washed over me. I realized that the greatest revenge I had executed was not the forensic audit. It was not handing the federal agents the ironclad evidence to arrest Cameron. It was not exposing Jason's betrayal or stripping Joanne of her precious country club status. Those were simply the necessary mechanical corrections of a universe rebalancing its scales. The ultimate revenge was the absolute utter indifference I now felt toward all of them. The true victory was becoming a woman so overwhelmingly successful, so deeply fulfilled, and so fiercely protected by her own power that their toxicity could no longer reach me. They were permanently trapped in the miserable wreckage of their own terrible choices while I was standing on top of the world, completely unbothered. I had taken the heavy stones they threw at me and built an untouchable empire. And as I raised my glass to the sparkling city skyline, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never let anyone make me feel small ever again.